What is happening, everyone? Signing in for another podcast, audiobook on the Federal Reserve Act and some journal findings I want to go through again. Now, I'll keep this series is going to be coming to an end pretty soon because I'm running out of content. Basically, what we're seeing is old journals and pulling them up, researching. And what it is showing is, I'm going to get my PDFs up. Alright, here we go. So the other day, I was going through the Federal Reserve Act, capital earnings deposits of the Federal Reserve Banks. Mind you, this was back in 1920-ish. So a few things have changed after I read all of this on stream, on live. In real time, I was able to watch myself slowly come to the realization, I don't know what I'm talking about, in the way that I wish I did. That is why I want to do some more research on live on stream and try and figure out what it is we're all actually talking about when we say the Federal Reserve is not, part of the government, or what it is, why we should audit the Fed, things like that. I think I want to pull away from the realm of conspiracy, because sometimes, depending on how you frame it, a conspiracy could be, incompetence. A conspiracy could quite easily be true. It's just, for some reason, if you frame it in a certain way, might want to make someone look silly, foolish. You might deem them a conspiracy theorist. That is why I thought I would do this series of, live on stream, just going through some reports, going through some data, analyzing it, And if you were to submit it, I guess you could, or if you were to submit it anywhere, I'd say it was like some sort of research paper, then you could get graded on it, So I thought that would be a pretty interesting thought experiment. It's funny though when you think about it, because when you're submitting reports to be graded, quite often you have an objective. Like, what is the objective? What am I trying to achieve here? And how clearly did I explain what I was trying to achieve? Did I use enough sources, references, and things like that? Is it accurate, or is it just purely wrong? Those things are conducted in the real world, as we are all aware. However, when it comes to online streaming, maybe it's just merely a clown world of just saying things that entices people to view. And when you actually go back and review, you realize you haven't actually said anything at all. Hence, why in many cases, you should probably not listen to this stream. You should probably not listen to anyone's stream, to be honest, on the internet. When you're looking for, real accurate analysis, maybe do your own, go to the experts, maybe buy it. I don't know. I don't know. Or if you are an expert, then yeah, maybe you do it, because quite often you put information behind a paywall, or you make a book and you charge for it. It'll be better received because you paid for it. But the same thing you might put on stream and give out for free, but people don't seem to care, don't pay attention. I'm sure it's a funny world. If I figure out marketing, I'll let you all know. But yeah. So what do we got? We have, so after I went through this section 3 of this particular report, I'm like, this is ringing a bell. And that reminded me when someone brought to my attention earlier on in the year, because this year has absolutely flown by, basically the reserve limits were reduced. Now, where is it? It had the structure of the different types of banks, and it had the amount of Federal Reserve, the capitals requirements, the earnings deposits of the federal banks, and how that sort of works. Then that reminded me of this particular section here. Now, this goes on to further explain how the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System works and functions. The Federal Reserve Act of 1913 establishing the Federal Reserve System as the central bank of the United States to provide the nation with a safer, more flexible, and more stable monetary and financial system. The law sets out the purpose, structure, and functions of the system, as well as outlines aspects of its operations and accountability. Congress has the power to amend the Federal Reserve Act, which it has done several times over the years. The complete act, as amended, is proved here by section. Now, it does break down all the different parts of the Federal Reserve Act. Now, that might be for another time. We'll go through all of that. But we do have here the, where is it? I guess what I'm trying to say is, after reading all of these long-winded, lots of words, lots of data to take in from these reports, some of it starts to sink in. Some of it starts to sound familiar. So this one here, it actually breaks down the reserve requirements. So that's what the other article here was kind of alluding to. No, not me. This one here. Where it started to talk about, since the capital of each of the Federal Reserve banks is to be exactly 6% of the capital and surplus of the member banks, it will, in its district, it will always be subject to slight variations. It went on to explain the actual rough figures, depending on what sort of bank it was. It broke down regarding the Central Reserve cities, had requirements in regards to reserves of, these figures here. Now, what I found interesting was when you go over and check it against the modern, up-to-date, information, I guess because it's important to update your worldview, you actually have here the reserve requirements. And I'm like, that sounds so familiar. As announced on March 15, 2020, the board reduced reserve requirements ratios to 0% effective March 26, 2020. This action eliminated reserve requirements for all depository institutions. So basically, this whole section of research is no longer relevant. So coming back to here, the following content explains the board's authority to impose reserve requirements and how reserve requirements were administered prior to the change in reserve requirement ratios to 0. Additional details of this reserve requirement regime can be found in the Archive Reserve Maintenance Manual. So I opened this up. Again, more and more information readily available. So if one wants to audit the Fed, maybe this is the beginning step. Now, the Federal Reserve Act authorizes the board to establish reserve requirements with specific ranges for purposes of implementing monetary policy on certain types of deposits and other liabilities of depository institutions. Now, again, sounding familiar to the original article, original analysis. Now, that wasn't from Homer Joseph Dodge, but I will continue to read that one after I go through this section here. The dollar amount of depository institution reserve requirements is determined by applying the reserve requirement ratios specific to the board regulation D. Now, reserve requirements of depository institution, 12 CFR Part 204, to an institution's reserve liabilities, see table of reserve requirements. It actually breaks down with notes. The notes are very interesting to go over. The Reserve Act authorizes the board to impose reserve requirements on transaction accounts, non-personal time deposits, and euro currency liabilities. Prior to the change effective March 26, 2020, the reserve requirement ratios on net transaction accounts differed based on the amount of net transaction accounts at the depository institution. A certain amount of net transactions accounts, known as the reserve requirement exemption amount, was subject to a reserve requirement ratio of net 0%. Net transaction account balances above the reserve requirement exemption amount and up to a specific amount, known as the low reserve tranche, were subject to a reserve requirement ratio of 3%. Net transaction account balances above the low reserve tranche were subject to a reserve requirement ratio of 10%. The reserve requirement exemption amount and low reserve tranche are indexed each year pursuant to formulas specified in the Federal Reserve Act. See table below. The table of low reserve tranche amounts and exemption amounts since 1982. Now, from more history on the changes in reserve requirement ratios to indexation of the exemption and low reserve tranche, see the annual review table. Additional details on reserve requirements can be found in this Federal Reserve Bulletin article, the appendix of which has tables of historical data, of historical reserve ratios. Now here we've got the actual breakdown. Current day reserve requirements: net transaction accounts, liability type, non-personal time deposits, and euro currency liabilities. Percent of liabilities is set to 0 as the requirement. The effective date breaks down. Not sure how they get the 12th or 27th dates, but we'll have a look into this particular website, document, article, report a little bit further. Now it says here, return to text. The link, but notes the board regulation D reserve requirements of depository institutions provide that reserve requirements must be satisfied by holding vault cash, and if vault cash is insufficient, by maintaining a balance in an account at the Federal Reserve Bank. An institution may hold that balance directly with a reserve bank or another institution in a pass-through relationship. Reserve requirements are imposed on depository institutions defined as commercial banks, savings and loan associations, credit unions, US branches and agency of foreign banks, edge corporations, and agreement corporations. Again, we pause here. Why am I even bothering covering this particular topic? Again, not from the US, from Australia. Well, we can see the upcoming monetary policy decisions being discussed, probably as we speak, in the US regarding to the Federal Reserve and its meetings. Those policies will flow on to the greater economy, and the economy will affect us here in Australia. And will it probably affect you as what I assume to be cryptocurrency holder, or any participant in any particular economy around the globe, because the world is so small now, it is so entangled. We can see sanctions affect one country, which then flow on to affect others because we live in such a complex system. Now, low reserve tranches amounts and exemptions amounts since 1982. It breaks down these figures. I won't cover them, but for some reason, funnily enough, it's entered in backwards. This one, there's another one. Here, the notes are entered in backwards. So what we see is, maybe someone wanted to copy and paste a different way, but anyway, we have here at the very top, January 14, 1982, low reserve tranche amount, millions of US dollars, 26. Exemption amount, millions of US dollars, is not available, not applicable. And on the 1st of January 2022, we have low reserve tranche amount, millions of US dollars, is 640 and 6, and we've got exemption amount, millions of US dollars, 32.4. It has increased over time, and what I found after reading all this is my lack of understanding of what all this actually means. So if the reserve requirements themselves have been reduced to 0 from from the very inception, it was talked about fractions of in 18ths, 15ths, and even 12ths. If we switch articles. What does it actually mean in the real world application? Because what is the Federal Reserve in control of, and what are they trying to achieve, and how does it actually affect us? That's why I'm making these streams for myself, for my personal development, to try and figure out where my understandings are and how accurate they are, and if they are indeed accurate, or do they need improvement? I think they need improvement. Now, regulatory changes in reserve requirements and indexation of low reserve tranche and the reserve requirement exemption. This is the interesting part. Now, should be able to read that on stream, depending on how large your screen is. We have here, on the effective date of December 1st, 1959, member banks were allowed to count part of their vault cash as legal reserves, right? Okay, so that refers back to the very beginning, with the requirements were broken down into 12ths, 18ths, and 16ths even. Now, second, effective January 1st, 1960, the reserve computation and maintenance period for central city banks and reserve city banks continue to be 1 week. All banks, including country banks, continue to compute and hold reserves contemporaneously. In addition, beginning with the period ending January 13, 1960, the reserve computation and maintenance periods for all banks were made to end on Wednesday. So slight updates. Then we have number 3. Effective 1st of September 1960, the reserve requirement of Central Reserve City banks against their net demand deposits was reduced from 18% to 17.5%. This said the action reduced requirement reserves approximately 120 million. Again, there's a lot more to unpack with these words because there's so much more to this. And we basically are subject to this because we are participants in the economy, and most of us, I would say, do not actually understand this, and most of us, I would say, do not actually care, and most of us do not actually think how we can maybe influence this sort of processes even. Maybe we do have to get involved peacefully, politically, legally, and lawfully. But again, I digress, because I doubt anyone's actually hearing this. Now, effective September 1st, 1960, the reserve requirement of Central Reserve City banks against their net demand deposit was reduced from 18% to 7.5%. Okay? Now, number 4. I wonder if I can highlight these off so I don't have to look at them anymore. Alright, that's done. Now, 4. Effective November 24, 1960, member banks were allowed to count all vault cash as legal reserves. Again, another update. The 5th, effective November 24, 1960, the reserve requirement of country banks against their net demand deposits was increased from 11% to 12%. This action increased required reserves approximately 380 million. Mind you, then the end result is 0. And we'll see why, hopefully by the end of this stream. Number 6, effective date December 1st, 1960, the reserve requirement of Central Reserve City banks against their net demand deposits was reduced from 17.5% to 16.5%. This action reduced reserve requirements approximately 250 million. You can see a trend starting to form here. Assuming inflation was increasing at these times. Effective July 28, 1962, the Central Reserve classification was eliminated and the former Central Reserve City banks were reclassified as Reserve City banks. So the other article we were reading before was no longer as valid as it once was, or as relevant as it once was, because again, these things have all changed. So it's important to update your worldview. And I will also where is it? There was a really good, really good yeah, this one here. We'll play this at the end. I think it's relevant. Before we continue on, we will get back to where I was here. Now, effective October 25, 1962, the reserve requirement of Reserve City banks against their time deposits was reduced from 5% to 4%. This action reduced required reserves by approximately 410 million. Again, reducing as inflation increases. Effective first note, again, that could be irrelevant. That's just what I'm noticing. I need to dig deeper to see actually how and why that would affect us all, if at all. Is this even relevant at all? Effective 1st, 1962, the reserve requirement of country banks against the time deposits was reduced from 5% to 4%. This action reduced required reserves approximately 360 million. Okay. Again, more actions to decrease. And let's have a look. Now, effective July 14, 1966, the reserve requirement of Reserve City banks against time deposits other than saving deposits in excess of 5 million was increased from 4% to 5%. This action increased required reserves approximately 350 million. So it's not all going in the one direction. Effective July 21st, 1966, the reserve requirement of country banks against time deposits other than saving deposits in excess of 5 million was increased from 4% to 5%. This action increased reserve approximately 70 million. Now, it's quiet just at the moment. Financial Times is saying Fed is set to implement a half a point rate rise for the first time since May. Again, that's probably what's going to happen. But yeah, anyway, Anyway, we'll let mainstream media do their job. Hey, Finbear, what's happening? This one is gonna be another tedious one, but I thought I will cover it since Hex has given me back some time. So I'm gonna try and go over the federal. So the reports I've been reading, basically, long story short, out of date, updating worldview, going over the current Federal Reserve government and document, website, whatever you want to call it, and reports. And the notes are pretty damn interesting because I did notice, someone pointed out a while ago, but then through research I discovered that, you know, the reserves required were back to zero. And I thought, well, I don't understand how that is actually going to affect me and how it's going to affect all of us as participants in this particular economy. So I'm going to try and make a series based on the Federal Reserve and gather as much information as I possibly can and see what I can learn, where my gaps of understanding are. Because I think it's pretty important, because a lot of this stuff, as you'll see, is just we're basically like governed by very complex systems, and most of us, if not all of us, have no input into how this system operates. And I don't know how to convey this message to people. I don't know how to basically implement any change, because what can one individual do to change a monstrous system like the Federal Reserve? I guess trying to teach may help in this situation. I'm not sure, but to be able to teach, you have to understand, and that's where my lack of understanding probably is the reason why I can't be as effective as I want to be. So I thought I'll make these streams, practice some speaking, and who knows, Hexagon for president, I don't know. Anyway, so effective September 8th, 1966, the reserve requirement of reserve city banks against 3 time deposits other than savings deposits in excess of 5 million was increased by 5% to 6%. This action increased required reserves approximately 370 million. So we've got 13th note, effective September 15, 1966, reserve requirement of country banks against the time deposits other than savings deposits in excess of 5 million was increased from 5% to 6%. This action increased required reserves approximately 75 million. So it's not always going, as I said before, in the same direction. Eventually we know where it ends at 0, and inflation where that's going. But over time it did actually increase and decrease. So their policies were changing. They weren't rigid. Note number 14, effective March 2nd, 1967, the reserve requirement of all member banks against saving deposits had the first 5 million of time deposits was reduced from 4% to 3.5%. This action reduced the required reserves approximately 425 million. Okay, so that one was a big one. Note number 15, effective March 16, 1967, the reserve requirement of all member banks against saving deposits and the first 5 million of time deposits was reduced from 3.5% to 3%. This action reduced the required reserves approximately 425 million again. Okay, so they're decreasing there. 16, effective January 11, 1968, the reserve requirement of reserve city banks against net demand deposits in excess of 5 million was increased from 16 to 16? To 0.5% to 17%. 16.5 to 17. This action increased required reserves approximately 360 million. Okay, so that increased. 17, effective January 18, 1968, the reserve requirement of country banks against net demand deposits in excess of 5 million was increased from 12% to 12.5%. This action increased required reserves approximately 190 million. So again, I'm not sure how all of this actually affects the end user. The most recent thing on top of all of this is basically going to be how the well, I guess part of the point is there's insane amount of infrastructure in place, and why the US dollar isn't going anywhere. I don't think many people have been through this entire website and read every single page. Something I might be doing, I'm not sure yet, and I'm pretty sure that the understanding is just not there across the board. What I will do though, I do have you watching, I don't want to bore you death. Oh, no, that's all good. Okay, so 18th, effective 12th, 1968, Regulation D was amended to 1. To reduce reserve computation and maintenance periods for country banks from 2 weeks to 1 week to coincide with 1 week periods. 1 week periods to reserve city banks, changed contemporaneous reserves requirements to lagged reserve requirements (LRR), which required all banks to compute weekly average required reserves for maintenance week on basis average daily deposits 2 weeks earlier. 3. Count average vault cash held 2 weeks earlier toward the required reserves for present week. And 4. Allow either excess or deficiencies averaging up to 2% of required reserves can be carried forward to the next maintenance week. Alright, that was a different one. Alright, what's happening if you're tuning in? This is basically a breakdown of the entire Federal Reserve website. Not all today, but over time. And I'm going to point out some blind spots which I have in regards to the Federal Reserve System, and hopefully be able to figure out how we can somehow peacefully politically affect change in the future. I guess, well, I do have a few. I will actually play this. This was pretty interesting. Here, I'm not sure what this is going to play through actually. Hang on, change my audio and where is it? Delay. There it is. Should be coming through now. Basically, this one here is a pretty interesting video. I'll just change my audio settings so you don't get mad feedback. Alright, this was a pretty
technology like
good, very good.
And Mr. Ray, I appreciate you mentioning your concerns in the beginning of my questioning about the concentration of power in a small group of individuals with no oversight. That is the exact problem that open and permissionless technology like crypto and blockchain solve. It solves for the problems of centralization. You stated in your testimony that you've never seen such a, quote, utter failure of corporate controls at every level of an organization, from the lack of financial statements to a complete failure of any internal controls or governance whatsoever, close quote. FTX had disastrous or even non-existent systems for accounting, audit, cash management, cybersecurity, human resources, risk management, and other unacceptable management practices that currently make your job to uncover the facts quite difficult. Fortunately, the immutable characteristics of public blockchains that some people would care not to understand in this committee allowed the crypto community to reveal Sam Bankman-Fried's fraud, and the on-chain public record will assist law enforcement moving forward. I encourage my colleagues to understand Sam Bankman-Fried's con for what it is: a failure of centralization, a failure of business ethics, and a crime. It is not a failure of technology. I've worked across the aisle since I came to Congress, so the future of crypto reflects American values, the same way the internet does today. For the most engaged members of Congress on crypto policy, the FTX collapse reminds us of why we care so deeply about this technology. Decentralization is the point. Thank you, and I yield back.
I think that guy gets it. I wish more hexagons were in that position to be able to explain this to people that rule over us. Now, back to the Federal Reserve website. We have effective. Actually, while I'm here, since we did read all this section, let's highlight a. Why'd that go red? Really? Red? Okay, fine. Be red. Again, if you're watching this on the replay, I'm so sorry. But this has to be done. I've not seen anyone else do it. Someone who thought. I'm not Comment 19. Effective April 17, 1969, the reserve requirement of all member banks against the net demand deposits was increased half a percentage point. This action increased required reserves to approximately 660 million. Boom, done. 20. Effective October 1969, 10% margin reserve requirement was established on certain foreign borrowings, primarily Eurodollars, member banks, and sale of assets to their foreign branches. This action increased required reserves approximately 415 million. Boom, done. 21. Effective October 1st, 1970, the reserve requirement of all banks against the time deposits other than saving deposits in excess of 5 million was reduced from 6% to 5%. At the same time, a 5% reserve requirement was imposed against funds obtained by member banks through the issuance of commercial paper by their affiliates. This action was reduced required reserves to approximately 500 million net. Effective January 7th, 1971, number 22, the reserve requirement on certain borrowings, primarily Eurodollars by member banks, and sale of assets of foreign branch raised from 10% to 20%. This action had little effect on required reserves. Low. Okay. 23, we have a typo. Well done, Federal Reserve Government. Very, very good. 23, effective November 9, 1972. Regulation D and J were revised to adopt a system of reserve requirements against demand deposits of all member banks based on the amount of such deposits held by a member bank, and 2, to require banks, member and non-member, to pay cash items present by a Federal Reserve Bank on the day of presentation in funds available to the Reserve Bank on that day. These changes reduced requirement reserves approximately 2.5 billion effective November 9, 1 billion effective November 16, and increased reserve requirements by 300 million effective November 23. Low. That's not a typo. See? Gotta read it all. 24. Effective. 24, effective June 1, 1973, the board amended its Regulation D to establish a marginal reserve requirement of 8% against certain time deposits subject to the 8% reserve requirement, certain deposits exempt from the rate limitations of Board Regulation Q. In addition, reserves against certain foreign branches deposits were reduced 10% to 8%. These changes had little effect on the required reserves. Okay, so they're making changes with little effect on the required reserves. So what is the importance of the required reserves? Okay, if you're tuning in, I'm so sorry. This is going to be the most boring stream you've ever seen. But basically what I'm doing is going over the entire Federal Reserve Government website. It's going to be riveting. I'm cross-referencing it to some old articles which I'm going to be reading, old reports from journals. And basically as I was doing that, came across the discovery that other people had pointed out earlier to me that it was 0% reserve requirements. As you can see, I'm highlighting everything I've read so far. And basically, what does that actually mean? I'm yet to hear someone explain that to me in a way that makes sense. You know, what does it mean for a user of fiat? What does it mean? Is it the fact that the money is being printed infinitely or something like that, or is it just the structure is that deep, that dense, that the US dollar is not going anywhere? I think it's the latter. And I think that the central bank digital currency will probably be rolled out through the Federal Reserve, to be honest, because I don't think the US dollar is going to be going anywhere. I think it's going to be upgraded, but maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. That's why I'm reading this, to try and find out, because I have lots and lots of gaps in my understanding on how this whole system actually works. And peacefully and politically, I think we can make change. We just need to figure out how to make change, because yeah, I don't think streaming is going to do it. You know, I think it's going to be real world, in real life sort of actions, peacefully, politically, legal and lawfully. I'm not sure how just yet. Again, this is US based and I'm based in Australia, so maybe I can start my own political party, you know, the Hexagon political party. That'd be kind of funny. Anyway, back to what I was doing. Note number 25, effective July 12, 1973, reserve requirements were imposed against finance bills. This action increased required reserves approximately 90 million. 26, effective July 19, 1973, the reserve requirement against all net demand deposits, except for the first 2 million, was increased 0.5% point. This action increased required reserves approximately 760 million. 27. Effective October 24, 1973, the marginal reserve requirement against certain time deposits was increased from 8% to 11%. This action increased reserve requirements approximately 465 million. So we can see them going up and going down. What does it actually mean? Well, we've got the upcoming Federal Reserve press conference details, and they're going to explain how and what their next moves are, if they haven't already done so to a media outlet prior. Number 28, effective December 27, 1973, the marginal reserve requirement against certain time deposits was reduced from 11% to 8%. This action reduced required reserves approximately 360 million. 29, effective 1974, the marginal reserve requirement against time deposits in denomination greater than 100,000 and more than 4-month maturity was eliminated. This action reduced required reserves approximately 510 million. Again, thank you for tuning in, and I'm so sorry, this is going to be the most boring stream ever. It's going to be a part of a series of me going over the entire Federal Reserve Government website and seeing if we can understand it, if I can understand it, and seeing if there's a way that peacefully, politically, legally, lawfully, we can make change in this insane system, or are we going to sit back and watch a central bank digital currency be rolled out on the masses, which I fear could kind of be in the realms of possibility, given how this whole system has developed and evolved over time and is extremely strong. So the US dollar isn't going anywhere. However, its migration to a central bank digital currency could exist. I'm not sure. I'll see what I can find for you all. If I find anything, I'll let you know. Effective December 12, 1974, the reserve requirement against all time deposits with an original maturity of 6 months or longer was reduced from 5% to 3%. The reserve requirement against all time deposits with an original maturity of less than 6 months was increased from 5% to 6%. And the reserve requirement against the net demand deposits over 400 million was reduced from 18% to 17.5%. In addition, 3% marginal reserve requirement on large certificate of deposits with an initial maturity on less than 4 months was removed. These actions reduced required reserves approximately 410. Yeah. What's happening, Teen Top? Again, so sorry. Gonna be the most oh, hang on, I'll put the camera up. Going to be an extremely boring series of me going over the entire Federal Reserve System website, Federal Reserve Government website. It might get to the point where you just can't stand it anymore and you just have to leave the stream, just for this series anyway, because Hex has given me a lot of time, and yeah, so I thought I would try and cover this stuff, because I think the Federal Reserve System, as strong as it is, as robust as it is, as innovative as it is, I feel like, you know, something else is coming. I'm not sure what it is. So for now, let's cover what they've released to us. Number 31, effective February 13, 1975, the reserve requirements against all categories of net demand deposits of up to 400 million were reduced by 0.5% point, and the reserve requirements against the net demand deposit of more than 400 million was reduced 1%. The action reduced required reserves approximately 165 million. Interesting. That's a big one. uh, 32 effective May. Number 32, effective May. I'm not sure if it's you guys coming in and out. But again, sorry, worst stream ever. Laborious, tedious, mind-numbing. I'm going to do it. I'm going to cover every single page of the Federal Reserve Government to try and understand what it is they're actually telling us. Wish me luck. Effective May 22nd, 1975. The Federal requirement against foreign borrowings of member banks, primarily Eurodollars, was reduced from 8% to 4%. This action reduced requirement reserves approximately 800 million. The only positive thing I can think about this is it's going to get my, hopefully, smoothen out my public speaking, and hopefully, I'll put the camera on, hopefully it'll smoothen out my public speaking. Hopefully it'll reduce any misreads. Maybe it'll get me ready for a career in politics where I have to sit and read from a script, or create a new Hexagon political party here in Australia to help sync up with the Hexagon party in the US to conquer the world. I don't know, to create a new world currency called Hex, which I don't think is going to happen. Although, we live in strange times, so who knows? But I'm not going to be shilling that one here. Alright, 33. Effective October 30, 1975, the reserve requirement against member bank time deposits with an original maturity of 4 years or more was reduced from 3% to 1%. This action reduced required reserves approximately 360 million. Number 34. Effective January 8, 1976, the reserve requirement on time deposits maturing 180 days to 4 years was reduced from 3% to 2.5%. This reduced required reserves by approximately 500 million. Note number 35. Effective December 30, 1976, the reserve requirements against net demand deposits. Social Hexagon Party of Australia. Yeah. I don't know what I'll call it, man. I think if I was going to run, I've thought this through. If I was going to run a political campaign, it sounds kind of stupid, but seriously, if I guess the main 3 things, maybe 4 things now with cryptocurrency, maybe 5. I'm not sure about the 5th one because it's a bit of a hot topic right now here in Australia, kind of. So I would be pro freedom of internet, so being able to make sure the internet is as open and free as possible, so to be the opposite of China. I would be 4 things: pro internet. I would be probably pro cannabis, because here in Australia, in the ACT, which is our capital state, people are actually able to, I think, legally grow it and consume it. Now, I know in some other states, other countries in Europe, etc., it's fine. But for some reason here in Australia, in that state, it's okay. But yet in other states, it's not legal. Although the penalties aren't very harsh at all, but it can cause all sorts of headaches. I would probably be pro-choice, pro-freedom of... I'll basically decriminalize prostitution, because the laws that we have currently here in South Australia are pretty archaic and old. It makes no sense. And if someone wants to go down that avenue, I'll treat it similar to cannabis. So I'd have free and open internet, pro-cannabis, pro-prostitution. And also, I mean, that sounds a bit strange, but maybe get some votes. Maybe people like that. I don't know. I would probably be more... I'm not sure about this one. It would be pro-gun, but I'm not sure how, in what way. It would probably be more toward, because we've already lost our freedoms here in Australia. So it would probably be more, if you legally can obtain one, then maybe you have more access to them easier, because I was talking about this before. I can't see the need for maybe like a conceal and carry here in Australia. Maybe I'll ease up on things like self-defensive, like mace and pepper spray. Because I mean, what if some poor woman's walking around, she has no method of defense except for, say, a pen and a torch or something, I'd like to see that changed. But yeah. Yeah, I remember watching his stream early on. It was funny as. early on. But yeah, no, I mean, and it's like, why should, like, I don't know, like, it doesn't seem right that the, how to word it, doesn't seem right that if adults are consenting upon an agreement should be, why should we live in a huge nanny state? it's not an anti-government statement. It's more like, give us some more freedoms, give us some more liberties, basically, sort of thing. Because, you know, as an adult, we can make informed decisions, generally speaking. And in regards to those things, I can't see how they're going to really severely affect humanity. That's just me. Now, back to the boredom. Oh my god. Will I get through this website? I'm not even sure. Yeah, I think that as a of course, I would probably be pro-crypto. I'm not sure how I'd be pro-crypto, because being pro-crypto could mean all for regulation and taxing it. I would be more inclined to think crypto, depending on what you're investing in or how you're investing it. Yes, it could be taxed, but if you're sort of, you know, minting it from thin air, I don't think that should be. You should read the on-chain data, for example. And I would be I'm not against the SEC cracking down on FTX at all. I mean, if they're going around scamming people out of money, pushing people away from cryptocurrency, that's not a good thing for cryptocurrency as a whole. Even though, as I played earlier, the cryptocurrency technology is different from a middleman exchange, which is like not what cryptocurrency was for. Yes, I'd be for promoting, teaching about cryptocurrency and how to hold your coins, how to hold your keys, how to not get scammed, how to spot the difference between a scam, basically. And that's where the problem is with the whole argument for, say, as a political movement towards pro-prostitution. The problem would be, well, what happens to the money? What if the money is being laundered? That would be, you know, hard to deal with, because that's a different issue. That's not the same issue. That's quite often where things get mixed up. It's like, how do you decorrelate gun crime from gun ownership? How do you decorrelate, you know, if someone commits a crime and they use money as part of the crime? What, do you ban all money? That's kind of insane, you know. I don't know. Anyway, back to my Federal Reserve analysis. Potential order of their website. Alright, so number 35. Effective December 30, 1976. The reserve requirement against net demand deposits on up to 10 million. Is anyone else in here? There's a couple. Alright, cool. So 35. Effective December 30, 1976, the reserve requirement against net demand deposits up to 10 million was reduced by 0.5 percentage point, and the reserve requirement against the net demand deposits over 10 million was reduced by 0.25 percentage point. This action reduced required reserves by approximately 550 million. Note 36. The effective November 16, 1978, the supplementary reserve requirement of 2% was imposed on time deposits of 100,000 or more. This action increased required reserves approximately 3 billion. Okay, that's a different one. Time deposits. Okay. Again, a very common financial tool. Time deposit. Effective November 30, 1978, the 10% minimum required on the domestic deposits of edges was removed, but edges continue to be subject to the same reserve requirements as member banks. Okay. Again, what does that mean? I'll have to look it up. Note number 38. Effective October 11, 1979, a marginal reserve requirement of 8% was imposed on managed liabilities. A member of member banks, Edge Act corporations, and U.S. agencies and branches of foreign banks above the base average for 2 weeks ending in September 26, 1979. Managed liabilities introduced large time deposits, 100,000 or over, with maturities of less than 1 year. Repurchase agreements against U.S. government and federal agency securities, Eurodollars borrowings, and Federal Reserve funds from a non-member institution on October 25th. Required reserves and reserves held by Edge Act corporations were included in member bank reserves. Previously, reserves held by these institutions were recorded as other deposits by federal banks, and these actions raised questions. RAID required reserves approximately 320 million. legalize or do, pun intended. I was just thinking about that. We've actually see, it's funny here in Australia, right? We got like the laws are different from state to state. It's regarding everything. It's painful. Like we don't even have a driver's license that's like throughout all of Australia. It's all different state issued. So legalize or decriminalize of prostitution is coming to Australia, pun intended. Yeah, so in other states it's not illegal from memory, but it has to be that they are somewhat almost registered. So it's kind of a strange setup, but it's not illegal by any means in other states. But for some reason in certain states it is, and I'm like scratching my head going, that makes no sense. Like I said with the cannabis, I think the growing of and consuming of in some states, it's actually, they've made it perfectly legal in small amounts. You can't buy it from shops yet, but I think that is coming. And they've got soon, it's been approved that CBD oil and gummies, like pain relief, natural pain relief, is going to be something you can get from over the counter from a pharmacy. But it's taken so long and it's so painful to get their hands on. It's very bureaucratic, I guess. Lots of processes. I was trying to ask a chemist the other day, and one of them freaked out. Another one gave me a whole spiel, explaining how it's coming in 12 months. So depending on who you talk to and their perception on life, will affect the answer you get from them. Because all I was asking, I said, can we get CBD oil? Or not the oil, sorry, the gummy. The like doesn't get you high or anything. It's purely for medicinal purposes. I'm like, why isn't that legal? You know, the whole argument is that. But yeah, so I think that's maybe somehow through political teaching. I don't want to say that though, because then you might be teaching the wrong thing to someone else, and then someone else that might have different beliefs, opinions, and then you end up in a shit show. So basically, I'm hoping we all get together and can sort this shit out, because only through talking to each other are we going to actually fix this planet. Because at the moment, the way things are going, it's kind of weird. Now, where are we going? Yeah, that's pretty interesting. Number 39. Effective March 12th, 1980, the 8% marginal reserve requirement was raised. 10% addition. The base upon which the marginal reserve requirement was calculated was reduced. This action increased required reserves about 1.7 billion. Okay. Number 40. Effective May 29, 1980, the marginal reserve requirement was reduced from 10% to 5%, and the base upon which the marginal reserve requirement was calculated was raised. This action reduced reserves up to about 980 million, close to a billion. Okay, what's happening? Same in USA, some states have. Yeah, I mean, hey, man, I've heard, like, even the gun laws in the US, some of them are very similar to Australia, but then you just drive, between a different state and then the law changes. It's insane. And some of them, like, I think even have the whole, like, the magazine capacity in the US, which is quite a surprise, because, you hear all sorts of stories and then you actually deal with the facts relevant to the particular state, and it's quite different. That's why it's so easy to fall into the not conspiracy realm, but there's the incompetence realm. You hear it once and it's true, it's fact, and it's actually not. It's very hard to sort out. Like, I remember hearing all of Australia was locked down and we have internment camps, and I'm like, nah, man, I'm pretty sure I was okay for a little bit. I mean, we did have some stuff, but the way it was spreading around the world was it was different. Again, from state to state, depending on how that state's run, it depends on what actually took place. And here in Australia, man, it's actually pretty chill. Like, that's why it would be hard to argue for, or it wouldn't be hard to argue for, because I can see the benefits of it. But for instance, say in all of Australia you wanted to argue for legalized conceal and carry. The question would be, well, why? Because there's not that much like gun crime in the street, so not so much reason to defend yourself. Maybe you could argue for, like, well, every house should have a firearm or something like that, or a means to protect themselves if there's like some psycho people trying to come to your house and you have to resort to lethal means beyond like I don't know, like blunt instruments. It's just funny. Not sure how that would be tackled, because I can see the argument for it, but I can also see the argument against it. So it's always good to play both sides, not play both sides, but understand both sides and which side has the stronger argument. Because otherwise you'll be stuck in a situation or a government where you just go by what they say, and that kind of sucks. I don't like that, because yeah, it's good when it's right, when it's done right, but what about when it's done wrong? And you have no room to move or push back against things. So it's a very slippery slope into tyranny, is what I think. Yeah, I guess it's just a funny. I don't see the, like, if I know it's probably not the best trade or whatever, but I really can't see like, why is that something that the government should tell you that you can or can't do regarding the brothels, like if it's legal or not legal? It's very strange. What's the difference between that and just two consenting adults doing what they want to do? Like, it's very, very strange, bizarre, in my opinion. Again, then it gets slippery slope into violence and money, etc., etc. But yeah, that's some interesting stuff. Effective July 24, 1980, the 5% marginal reserve requirement on managed liabilities and the 2% supplementary reserve requirement against large time deposits were removed. These actions reduced required reserves about $3.2 billion. Yeah, it's a big one. 4.2. Effective November 13, 1980, required reserves of member banks and Edge Act corporations were reduced by $4.3 billion, and required reserves of other depository institutions were increased by about $1.4 billion due to the implementation of Monetary Control Act 1980. Welcome to the stream. Again, sorry, this is going to be the most boring stream you are ever going to see. Possibly boring series of streams. I'm going to basically go over the entirety of the Federal Reserve Act, and as I'm going, I'm highlighting just to keep track. And then occasionally someone will just ask some stuff in the chat, mainly, I guess, political sort of topics. I'll try and keep it out of the realm of conspiracy, because more often than not, like with this whole Federal Reserve, quite often you hear all sorts of statements made about it, but when I actually go back and look through the journals, what do I actually understand about it? I should be able to easily cite to you why this is good, why this is bad, but I have difficulties doing so. That's why I'm trying to develop my understanding about the Federal Reserve, maybe practice some public speaking as well. So when I run for President of Australia under the Hexkin banner, I'll be well endowed to do so. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, exactly right. It like you can, the argument for it, then what could and what does that lead to? You're right, it opens up all sorts of cans of worms. It's like by saying legalizing prostitution, but then are you legalizing pimps? Are you legalizing human trafficking? I would say no and no, but sometimes those two items could be tied up, and more often not are tied up with that. And then again, the money issue as well. I guess like the tax laws have that covered somewhat, but then like what if they're pimping and human trafficking and laundering money? It's like, well, the laws didn't make that legal. It just made prostitution legal. And then, yeah. It's a strange topic because the assumption is people just do, well, the idea would be people do the right thing, tell the truth what they're doing. But then you have the flow-on effects in a complex system, making things more complex. It's like, how do you regulate? So it seems like the answer in some cases appears to be just ban it all. And if you ban it all, you ban it all and put your head in the sand and it doesn't exist. It's like, hang on. Yeah, that's Yeah, well, but that is not cool. That is not cool at all. So yeah, you're right. Then you'd have to legislate. You'd have to specifically legislate age, which is insane to think about, because then the politicians will sit around and be going, we're really going to talk about this. We're really going to be talking about, how to explain what is and isn't legal, when the laws already cover it mainly. But then, yeah, it's a very weird topic. And then think about all the, what if someone starts identifying as something else? What sort of a mindfuck is that for writing legislation? It's like, what if you identify as, so you've gone through and you're like, no, children, no, pimping, no, human trafficking, no, money laundering, no. And it's like, well, what if this person's identifying as a fucking car? So I can't rent a car? Yeah, I don't know. It's a very... Sorry whoever else is in the chat, but yeah. You might have to go back and rewatch and get the full context. I was basically saying, if I would run a political party in Australia, some things I would be probably pro for. What is this? No. You can take... Didn't catch that one. I think they've done like that. That approach was rolled out in Europe, from memory. They like sort of said, I think it was the person who, they didn't legalize it, but they made I can't remember which way it went. It was the person actively seeking it out was the person who was in the wrong, basically. They like changed it and they put maybe that's what you're talking about. I'm not sure. Buying, selling. Yeah, I think it was the other way around in Europe. I'm pretty sure. I think it was actually in a sort of documentary, the red light district in the Amsterdam, they was trying to change it or something, but yeah, not sure. Would have to pull it up. Oh, okay. Oh, true. Yeah, so that's what I mean. Like that's why, like, the discussion is good, because then you can, depending on the geographics, you can see like how it's working here and how it's not working there. It's like, then you can maybe try and take the best approach. I'm not sure. And then everyone can sit back and be an armchair quarterback and say, oh, this is the best approach, or this is best. But depending on what country it's in, again, and what culture, it could be different effects, Don't know. That one's got me stumped. There's probably some research papers on it. I could probably pull up, but beyond that, Now, back to my... Where was I? 43, effective February 12th, 1981, in conjunction with the transnational phase-in program under Monetary Control Act, required reserves in certain November banks and foreign-related institutions increased by approximately 2.45 million. 44, effective March 12, 1981, in conjunction with the Transnational Phasing Program under Monetary Act, required reserves of small November quarterly reports increased about 7.5 billion. 45, effective May 14, 1981, in conjunction with the Transnational Phasing Program under the Monetary Control Act, required reserves of certain November banks and foreign related institutions increased by approximately 245 million. 46, effective 1981, in conjunction with the Transnational Phase-In Program under the Monetary Control Act, required reserves of certain November banks and foreign-related institutions increased approximately 230 million. 47, effective September 3, 1981, in conjunction with the Transnational Phase-In Program under the Monetary Control Act, required reserves under member banks were reduced about 2 billion, and required reserves of other depository institutions were increased by about 0.9 billion. 48, effective November 12, 1981, in conjunction with the Transnational Phasing Program under the Monetary Control Act, required reserves of certain November banks and foreign related institutions increased about 210 million. 49, effective January 14, 1982, the low reserve tranche and transaction accounts at depository institutions was raised from 25 million to 26 million. This action reduced required reserves approximately 60 million. 50, effective February 11, 1982, in conjunction with the Transnational Phasing Program under the Monetary Control Act, required reserves of certain November banks and foreign related institutions increased about 170 million. 51, effective March 4, 1982, in conjunction with the Transnational Phasing Program under the Monetary Control Act, required reserves of member banks decreased by about 2 billion. 52, effective May 13, 1982, in conjunction with the Transnational Phase-In Program under the Monetary Control Act, required reserves of certain non-member banks and foreign related institutions increased about 150 million. 53, effective August 12, 1982, in conjunction with the Transnational Phasing Program under the Monetary Control Act, required reserves of certain non-member banks and foreign related institutions increased of about 140 million. See, I wonder how hard it is to actually make your own bank. I'm pretty sure it's very difficult. Could you make a hexagon bank? I'm actually not sure. I'm pretty sure you couldn't. You could make it in DeFi, but in terms of integrating it into the legacy system, not so sure. We'll find out. Well, I'll try and find out. Yeah. Effective September 2, 1982, in conjunction with the Transnational Phasing Program under the Monetary Control Act, required reserves of member banks were reduced by about 2.1 billion, and required reserves of other depository institutions were increased about 0.9 billion. 55, effective October 28, 1982, in accordance with provisions of Depository Institutions of Act of 1982, the required reserves of certain former member banks were reduced by approximately 100 million. So yeah, as I read this, it's like, what am I actually reading? Does it even make any sense? Like, you'd have to research to understand what I'm actually saying, because again, in practice, how does this actually affect me? We go to the shops and we see inflation. I saw like a drink I used to buy was like $1, and it went up to $1.50 per can. I'm like, that's insane inflation in about a year, 2 years. But then you read all this and how the actual monetary system works, and it's like, that movie Wolf of Wall Street, it's just a big fugazi. Just what the actual fuck's going on. And by the time, if anyone, I've heard if people get legislation bills passed, the bills can be maybe as large as this entire website, and they get a week to decide over it, and you're given something this long in a week to decide. How do they even put this stuff together? It's mind-boggling, you know. It's mind-boggling how the policies get rolled out, and then we hear things like the certain acts have done this and certain acts have done that, and then hidden in the act is like something else. And it's like, what It doesn't seem very straightforward. Maybe blockchain can solve that, I don't know. Now, 56, effective December 23, 1982, in accordance with provisions of Depository Institutions Act of 1982 that exempted the first 2.1 million of reservable liabilities at all depository institutions from reserve requirements. Required reserves were reduced by an estimated 800 million. At this point, it's just figures. It's like, anyway. 57. Effective January 13, 1983, the low reserve tranche for transaction accounts at depository institution was raised from 26 million to 26.3 million. This action reduced required reserves approximately 32 million. Effective March 3, 1983, in conjunction with the transnational phase-in program under Monetary Control Act, required reserves of member banks were reduced by approximately 1.9 billion. 59. Effective April 14, 1983, required reserves were reduced an estimated 800 million as a result of the elimination of reserve requirements on non-personal time deposits with maturities of 2 to 2.5 years. Maturities of 2.5 years to 3.5 years. Number 60. Effective September 1st, 1983, in conjunction with the transnational phase-in program under the Monetary Control Act, required reserves of member banks were reduced to about 2 billion, and required reserves of other depository institutions were increased by about 0.9 billion. 61. Effective October 20, 1983, required reserves were reduced an estimated 100 million as a result of the elimination of reserve requirements on non-personal time deposits with maturities 1.5 years to 2.5 years. Okay. 62. Effective with reserve maintenance period beginning January 12th, 1984, the low reserve tranche for transaction accounts at depository institutions was raised from 26.3 million to 28.9 million. Also, in accordance with the provision of the Depository Institution Act of 1982, the reserve requirement exemption was raised from 2.1 million to 2.2. These actions reduced required reserve total of about 350 million. Okay. 63. Effective February 2nd, 1984, Regulation D was amended as follows for institutions reporting weekly on FR 2900. First, change the reserve computation and maintenance periods from weekly to bi-weekly, with the former ending on Monday and latter ending on Wednesday. Second, compute required reserves against net transaction deposits based on average deposits over the computation period ending 2 days before the end of the maintenance period. 3. Compute required reserves against non-transactional deposits based on average deposits over a computation period ending 17 days before the beginning of the maintenance period. And 4. Count the average vault cash held during a reserve computation period ending 17 days before the beginning of the reserve maintenance period towards required reserves. See, what does that even mean? That's insane. It must make sense to them, or did it? 64. Effective February 2nd, 1984, in conjunction with the transnational phase-in program under the Monetary Control Act, reserve required under member banks were reduced about 2 billion. 65. Effective September 13, 1984, in conjunction with the transnational phase-in program under the Monetary Control Act, required reserves of certain non-member depository institutions increased by about 1.8 billion. 1.08 billion. That's a difference there. 66. Effective with reserve maintenance period beginning January 3, 1985, the low reserve tranche for transaction accounts was raised from 28.9 million to 29.8 million. The reserve requirement exemption was also raised from 2.2 million to 2.4 million. These actions reduced required reserves by about 190 million. 67. Effective September 12, 1985, according to the transnational phase-in program under the Monetary Control Act, required reserves of certain non-member depository institutions were increased by about 1.23 billion. 68. Effective with reserve maintenance period beginning January 2nd, 1986, the low reserve tranche for transaction accounts was raised from 29.8 million to 31.7 million. The reserve requirement exemption was also raised from 20.4 million to 2.6 million. These actions reduced required reserves by about 340 million. That's a lot. Effective April 24, 1986, money market deposit accounts MMDA, which had previously been subject to full reserve requirements, were made subject to Transnational Phasing Program of Monetary Control Act. In addition, the order of application of the exemption applied to reserve liabilities was changed. These actions reduced required reserves about 260 million. Effective September 11, 1986, according to the Transnational Phasing Program under the Monetary Control Act, required reserves of certain non-member depository institutions were increased by about 1.58 billion. 71. Effective with reserve maintenance period, January 1st, 1987, the low reserve tranche for transaction accounts was raised 31.7 million to 36.7 million. The reserve requirement exemption was also raised 2.6 million to 2.9 million. These actions reduced required reserves by about 970 million. Seventy-two. Effective December 10, 1987, according to the Transnational Phasing Program under the Monetary Control Act, required reserves of certain non-member depository institutions were increased by about 170 billion. 73. Effective with reserve maintenance period beginning December 31, 1987, the low reserve tranche for transaction accounts was raised from 36.7 million to 40.5 million. These reserve requirement exemption was also raised from 2.9 million to 3.2 million. In the actions reduced requirement reserves by about 740 million. 74. Effective with reserve maintenance period beginning December 29, 1988, the low reserve tranche for transaction accounts was raised from 405 million to 41.5 million. These reserve requirement exemption was also raised from 33.2 million to 3.4 million. The actions reduced required reserves by an estimated 210 million. That's all good, man. Thank you for staying with us this long. 75. Effective with the reserve maintenance period beginning December 28, 1989, the low reserve tranche for transaction accounts was reduced from 41.5 million to 40.4. The reserve requirement exemption was kept 3.4 million. The action raised required reserves by an estimated 190 million. 76. Effective December 13, 1990, the percent reserve requirement on non-transactional liabilities was reduced to 1.5% for FR 2900 weekly reporters. The action lowered required reserves by an estimated 6.7 billion. 77. Effective December 27, 1990, the 1.5% reserve requirement on non-transactional liabilities was reduced to 0 for FR 2900 weekly reporters. The action lowered required reserves by an estimated 6.5 billion. Effective, number 78, effective with the reserve maintenance period beginning December 27, 1990, the low reserve tranche for transaction accounts was raised from 40.4 million to 41.1 million. The reserve requirement exemption was kept at 3.4 million. The action lowered required reserves by an estimated 112 million. Oh my god, this put me to sleep. 79. Effective with reserve maintenance period beginning January 17, 1991, the 3% reserve requirement on non-transactional liabilities was reduced to 0 for FR 2900 quarterly reports. The action reduced required reserves by an estimated 460 million. Number 80. Effective with the reserve maintenance period beginning December 26, 1991, the low reserve tranche for transaction accounts was raised 41.1 million to 42.2 million. The reserve requirement exemption was also raised from 3.4 million to 3.6 million. The actions reduced required reserves by an estimated 255 million. 81. Effective April 2nd, 1992, the 12% required reserve ratio against net transaction deposits above the low reserve tranche level was reduced to 10%. The action reduced reserve required by an estimated 8.9 billion. 82. Effective September 3rd, 1992, the carryover allowance for reserve balances for institution reporting weekly and quarterly on the FR 2900 was doubled to the larger of 50,000 or 4% of required reserves plus required clearing balances less the institution's required clearing balance penalty-free brand. Number 83. Effective November 12, 1992, the lag in continuing vault cash toward required reserve was shortened from 4 weeks to 2 weeks for institutions reporting weekly on the FR 2900, i.e. counting the average vault cash held during a reserve computation period toward long reserves in its corresponding reserve maintenance period. 84. Effective with the reserve maintenance period beginning December 24, 1992, the low reserve tranche for transaction accounts was raised 42.2 million to 46.8 million. The reserve requirement exemption was also raised from 3.6 million to 3.8 million. The actions reduced required reserves by an estimated 699 million. Effective with the reserve maintenance period beginning December 23, 1993, the low reserve tranche for transaction accounts was raised from 46.8 million to 51.9. The reserve requirement exemption was also raised from 38 million to 4 million. The actions reduced requirement reserves by an estimated 738 million. 86. Effective with the reserve maintenance period beginning December 22nd, 1994, the low reserve tranche for transaction account was raised 51.9 million to 54 million. The reserve requirement exemption was also raised from 4 million to 40.2 million. The actions reduced required reserves by an estimated 318 million. 87. Effective with the reserve maintenance period beginning December 21st, 1995, the low reserve tranche for transaction accounts was reduced from 54.0 million to 52.0 million. The reserve requirement exemption was raised from 4.2 million to 4.3 million. The actions raised required reserves by an estimated 199 million. Number 88. Effective with the reserve maintenance period beginning December 31st, 1996, the low reserve tranche for transaction accounts was reduced from 52.0 million to 43.9 million. The reserve requirement exemption was raised from 4.3 million to 4.4 million, and the actions raised required reserves to an estimated 298 million. 89. Effective with the reserve maintenance period beginning January 1st, 1998, the low reserve tranche for transaction accounts was reduced from 49.3 million to 47.8 million. The reserve requirement exemption was raised from 4.4 million to 4.7 million. The actions raised required reserves by an estimated 89 million. Number 90. Effective with the reserve maintenance period beginning July 30 to 1998, the required reserve system was shifted from CRR to new lagged reserve requirements LRR, with reserve computation periods for weekly reporters starting 30 days before the corresponding reserve maintenance periods. Under new LRR regime, the lagging counting vault cash toward required reserves was lengthened from 16 days to 30 days for institutions reporting on the FR 2900. In other words, the average vault cash held during the reserve computation period would be applied toward required reserves in its corresponding reserve maintenance period. It's funny, after all this, they just change it to 0. Maybe the situation has changed, I'm not sure. Now, effective for the reserve maintenance period beginning 31st, 1998, the low reserve tranche for net transactions accounts. Thank you for tuning in. Again, sorry, this is going to be really, really boring. I'm basically going through the Federal Reserve website, everything that I have on there, to hopefully try and gain a better understanding. Of how the Federal Reserve actually works, because after reading a lot of literature, I still don't actually know how it affects everything. I understand when we go to the shops, and you get you can see the inflation or you can see the rates being raised. That makes sense. But how does all of this actually affect us? Maybe it's something we should all try and find out, and maybe hopefully then I can figure out the next step. is how can I influence that? You know, maybe not in the US because I'm coming from Australia, but maybe we can all get together and try and teach and inform each other. You know, like an informed citizenry worldwide. Who knows? Like a bunch of Mexicans. But yeah, that's basically what I'm doing. So bear with me for these few federal. Well, it's going to be a few Federal Reserve streams. So if you see that, then that's most likely what I'm going to be doing. What else? I was talking about it would be funny, it would be cool if maybe we had some Mexican politicians, I'm not sure, in real life stuff, you know, to actively make change. And then I was talking about 4 things I might lobby for. But yeah, primarily it'll be the covering of very, very long-winded reports, articles, and data relating to the Federal Reserve. So hopefully we can figure out how to make change in regard to that topic. If you got any questions, sing out, let me know. I'll try and address. If not, I will continue on. Now, 91, effective for the reserve maintenance period beginning December 31st, 1998. The low reserve tranche for net transaction accounts was reduced from 47.8 million to 46.5 million. The reserve requirement exemption was raised from 40.7 million to 4.9 million. The actions raised required reserves by an estimated 104 million. 92. Effective for the reserve maintenance period beginning December 30, 1999, the low reserve tranche for the net transaction accounts was reduced from 46.5 million to 44.3 million. The reserve requirement exemption was raised from 4.9 million to 5 million. The actions raised required 7 reserves by an estimated 264 million. As I'm going through, I'm actually highlighting what I've read. So hopefully it keeps these highlights on when I come back to this webpage and I can literally see all the information that I presented and try and decipher what this zero reserve requirement actually means in the real world. Because I have a feeling we're going to witness central bank digital currency. I'll put the camera. I have a feeling we're going to witness some sort of central bank digital currency once it's ready, most likely through the Federal Reserve System. But yeah, I'm not sure when that's going to happen. If it's going to happen, it could be a mad conspiracy theory at the moment. But I have heard they're working on a central bank digital currency. I'm not sure how they're actually going to roll it out. Because most likely, if it's a central bank digital currency, you're going to have an account directly with the Federal Reserve themselves. If you're in the US, if in Australia, for example, would have an account directly with the Reserve Bank of Australia. It would actually bypass the middlemen banks, so to speak. But the Federal Reserve system is very, very strong, very, very robust, very, very innovative, and the US dollar is not going anywhere soon, anytime soon. That's why I'm making these streams. But I can see change coming. Again, I'll lead to that. I'll read a bit more later, and it will make a little bit more sense. Basically, for some context, I'm going through this because I went through this particular document here. And I came to realize that what I was reading was no longer relevant because it was talking about reserves. And I'm like, where have I heard these reserves? And then upon reading the background of that particular article, as I was reading through this, I'm like, oh, that makes sense, you know? The words started to make sense. Also, I'll be covering this particular individual here, Homer Joseph Dodge, not Homer Joseph Simpson, but Homer Joseph Dodge. Trying to find out more about this individual because some of his writings are very, very interesting and they came back from the early 1900s. So that's a little bit more about what I'll be doing for a little bit to come. And yeah, thank you for tuning in. But again, like I said, it's going to be pretty boring unless you have any questions or anything about anything. Feel free, go nuts in the chat. Try and address. Now back to where was I? 93. Effective for reserve maintenance period beginning December 28, 2000, the low reserve tranche for net transaction accounts was reduced from 44.3 million to 42.8 million. The reserve requirement exemption was raised from 5 million to 5.5 million. The action raised required reserves by an estimated 60 million. 94. Effective to the reserve maintenance period beginning December 27, 2001, the low reserve tranche for net transaction accounts was reduced from 42.8 million to 41.3 million. The reserve requirement exemption was raised from 5.5 million to 5.7. The action raised the total required reserves by an estimated 154 million. Again, all of this makes little sense at the moment to myself. That's why I'm reading, trying to get a better understanding of what it is I'm actually looking at. Number 95. Effective for the reserve maintenance period beginning December 26, 2002, the low reserve tranche for the net transaction accounts was increased from 41.3 million to 42.1. The reserve requirement exemption was raised from 55.57 million to 6.8 million. The actions lowered total required reserves by an estimated 201 million. 96. Effective for the reserve maintenance period beginning December 25th, 2003, the low reserve tranche for net transaction accounts was increased from 42.1 million to 45.4 million. The reserve requirement exemption was raised from 6 million to 6.6 million. The actions lowered total required reserves to an estimated 689 million. 97. Effective for the reserve maintenance period beginning 23rd of December 2004, the low reserve tranche for net transaction accounts increased from 45.4 million to 47.6 million. The reserve requirement exemption was raised from 6.6 million to 7.0 million. The actions lowered the total reserve requirements by an estimated 506 million. I guess for context, what I am actually reading is the notes to the section that relate to the regulatory changes in reserve requirements, the indexation of low reserve tranche and the reserve requirement exemption, basically how the reserve requirements are now currently at 0. And what does that actually mean? 98. Effective for reserve maintenance period beginning December 22nd, 2005, the low reserve tranche for net transaction accounts was increased from 47.6 million to 48.3 million. The reserve requirement exemption was raised from 7 million to 7.8 million. The actions lowered total requirement reserves by an estimated 369 million. Interesting. I kind of want to make that green. 369 was mentioned. Now, 99. Effective for the reserve maintenance period beginning December 21st, 2006, the low reserve tranche for net transaction accounts was reduced from 48.3 million to 45.8 million. The reserve requirement exemption was raised from 7.8 million to 8.5 million. The actions raised total requirement reserves by an estimated 146 million. Number 100. Effective for the reserve maintenance period beginning December 20, 2007, the low reserve tranche for net transaction accounts was reduced from 45.8 to 43.9 million. The reserve requirement exemption was raised from 8.5 million to 9.3 million. The actions raised total requirement reserves by an estimated 57 million. 101. Effective for the reserve maintenance period beginning 1st of January 2009, the low reserve tranche for net transaction accounts was raised from 43.9 to 44.4 million. The reserve requirement exemption was raised from 9.3 million to 10.3 million. The actions lowered total requirement reserves by an estimated 270 million. 102. Effective from the reserve maintenance period beginning December 31st, 2009, the low reserve tranche for net transaction accounts was raised 444.4 million to 55.2 million. The reserve requirement exemption was raised from 10.3 million to 10.7 million. These actions lowered total required reserves by an estimated 1.24 billion. 103, effective for the reserve maintenance period beginning December 30, 2010, the low reserve tranche for net transaction accounts was raised from 55.2 million to 58.8 million. The reserve requirement exemption remained at 10.7 million. These actions lowered total required reserves by an estimated 353 million. Alright, coming close to an end. 104, effective for the reserve maintenance period beginning December 29, 2011. The low reserve tranche for net transaction action accounts will raise from 58.8 million to 71 million. The reserve requirement exemption will raise from 10.7 million to 11.5 million. These actions will lower the total reserves required by an estimated 1.33 billion. 105, effective for the reserve maintenance period beginning December 27, 2012, the low reserve tranche for net transaction accounts will raise from 71 million to 79.5 million. The reserve required exemption will raise from 11.5 to 12.4 million. These actions will lower total required reserves by an estimated 971 million. (106) Effective for the reserve maintenance period beginning March 26, 2020, the 10% required reserve ratio against the net transaction deposits above the low reserve tranche level was reduced to 0%. Again, this is what I'm not understanding, why and how it affects the economy. The 3% required reserve ratio against the net transaction deposits in the low reserve tranche was reduced to 0%. The action reduced required reserves by an estimated 200 billion. That's the biggest figure we've seen. Okay, and this was the regulatory changes in reserve requirements and indexation of the low reserve tranche and the reserve requirement exemption. The following list covers regulatory changes in reserve requirements and indexation of other low reserve tranche and reserve requirement exemption beginning the 1st of December 1959 and their effects on the required reserves. Alright, one page down and I have no idea how much I've got left. I've got a lot. Like a lot. I'll check chat for a little bit. What is happening, Ash? I think Finbear and Tintop jumped out before because yeah, it was not much is happening. I'm pretty much going through all this. Discussed a couple other things like, you know, if I were to run as a politician, 4 things I'd run on. That's about it. Hoping to understand some of the Federal Reserve System. I will cover some of this particular individual. So get rid of this one. Homer Joseph Dodge. Again, he seemed to criticize and point out some flaws in the Federal Reserve System very, very early on. I'm not sure who he was. It's very hard to find information about him because he existed like in a time pre-internet. So any information that exists is in real life, hard copy, or whatever's been uploaded. I was lucky enough to obtain one of his books. It was actually signed by him, I think. I have to double check. I'll pull it out of storage and I might read that next. Yeah, that's so true. A lot of the politicians, I think maybe they have the right maybe they have the right motivations, but then they probably end up just there for the pay. They just argue about stuff and at the end of it they go to the pub and have a beer with each other and talk about the stuff they argued. Or maybe they don't, who knows. But I'm not sure if you could get some people who understand crypto in positions of power, if they would be able to, you know, help the rest of the world understand what crypto can be about. I'll play this one. I've played it a couple times before while I actually had some viewers, and it was pretty well said.
Thank you. And Mr. Ray, I appreciate you mentioning
Cabana retweeted it.
And Mr. Ray, I appreciate you mentioning your concerns in the beginning of my questioning about the concentration of power in a small group of individuals with no oversight. That is the exact problem that open and permissionless technology like crypto and blockchain solve. It solves for the problems of centralization. You stated in your testimony that you've never seen such a, quote, utter failure of corporate controls at every level of an organization, from the lack of financial statements to a complete failure of any internal controls or governance whatsoever, close quote. FTX had disastrous or even non-existent systems for accounting, audit, cash management, cybersecurity, human resources, risk management, and other unacceptable management practices that currently make your job to uncover the facts quite difficult. Fortunately, the immutable characteristics of public blockchains that some people would care not to understand in this committee allowed the crypto community to reveal Sam Bankman-Fried's fraud, and the on-chain public record will assist law enforcement moving forward. I encourage my colleagues to understand Sam Bankman-Fried's con for what it is: a failure of centralization, a failure of business ethics, and a crime. It is not a failure of technology. I've worked across the aisle since I came to Congress, so the future of crypto reflects American values, the same way the internet does today. For the most engaged members of Congress on crypto policy, the FTX collapse reminds us of why we care so deeply about this technology. Decentralization is the point. Thank you, and I yield back.
See, I don't mind, like, if you could get into a position of power and portray these messages in the places that count. Whether or not people hear him or not, though, is another question, because I've seen some Australian politicians, they keep driving that regulation could have saved everyone from being scammed from the FTX, and that the current government didn't do enough to regulate against cryptocurrency, and the lack of understanding is just very frustrating. I tried to email them, I guess my history in relation to cryptocurrency. Whether or not they even read it, who knows? Maybe they just hit delete. Yeah, I don't know any politicians myself. That would be pretty cool, I guess. Maybe get some things done. But yeah. Then again, you can end up trying to get some things done and kicking off a whole global trade war, and ending up in the situation, the supply chain shortage we're currently in now. But yeah. I guess what I'll do now is moving away from that. I played that a couple of times now. Yeah, I'll go back to Homer Joseph Dodge. So, which tax plan do we want? Comparing the Longworth, the Garner, and the Mellon plans. Again, this is 1924. I'm not sure how much influence this individual had, but his writings have been left, which is great. It made him immortal. And hopefully at the time, it wasn't just, pissing into the wind, so to speak. But looking back at his work, it's pretty on point, I thought. He points out a lot of flaws in the Federal Reserve System, points to improve, and now this is the latest thing. I haven't read this one yet. He discusses the tax system, I think, and it appears in the Bulletin of National Tax Association, so he must be must be a reputable writer, so to speak. And maybe it was a different time back then, maybe not. Maybe he was just equivalent to a modern day, not scholar, but modern day journalist. I'm not sure. But yeah, I'll continue. A heavy taxpayer recently came to Washington to remonstrate with the Bureau of Internal Revenue concerning an income tax assessment levied against him. But there is no equity in your assessment, he insisted to the official whose desk he had been assigned to him to pound. Equity, exclaimed the technically titled functionary. You surely did not expect to find any equity in taxation. That probably is the whole seat of trouble in disagreements over methods and rates of taxation. Fundamentally, taxes have nothing in common with equity. They are the most arbitrary of human inventions. As sure as death and taxes, runs the old saw, in recognition of this fact. The government must tax to maintain its establishments. The tax is imposed, always without the consent of the taxpayer. He may recognize a theoretical, idealistic right and necessary in taxation, but in personal application, any tax becomes arbitrary and inequitable. The game of taxation is the most precarious put and take game in the world. The theory is that the citizen pays an impost to the government, which in return furnishes him with certain rather vaguely defined services. The first is protection. On a basis of equity, an individual may feel that he does not need this protection, that he is willing to economize on protection and save his taxes. This view the government may not accept. He must pay for the service, whether he gets it or not. He must put up regularly and in the amount prescribed. What he can take depends upon his occasions and vicissitudes. The man knocked... Hang on, I need to look that up. You hear me when I'm reading, I'll be like, vicissitudes? Like thinking, what the fuck is this? Vicissitudes, a change of circumstance or fortune, typically one that is unwelcome or unpleasant. What he can take depends on his occasion and vicissitudes. Okay, that word not commonly used at all. Yeah, where was I? The man knocked down in a street and carried to a public hospital wins to some extent. So does the man whose house is saved by the fire department, but these winners appear to be in the minority. And where federal taxes are concerned, it may be even more rare to win. The dressmaker in a Bronx flat finds difficulty in seeing where she gets the worth of her tax money through the large appropriations to build the post office at East Cul-de-sac, Wisconsin. The New Mexico ranchman takes slight comfort from the federal expenditures upon Thatcher's light beacon. All these elements make harmony difficult among the framers of tax legislation. The fundamental lack of equity in taxation puts the whole task of writing revenue laws on a basis of finding what group of taxpayers will make the least protest. I repeat that. The fundamental lack of equity in taxation puts the whole task of writing revenue laws on the basis of finding what group of taxpayers will make the least protest. Had not the war draped 4th of July bunting around the idea of the income tax, attempts at evasion would be even more earnest than they now are. Just as the public was told that the halo hovered above the brow of the purchaser of the Liberty bonds, so it was proclaimed that frankness and liberality in paying income taxes placed a citizen automatically in the same class with Robert Morris and the giver of the widow's mite. There are increasing signs of relapse from this attitude. No less expert a man than Andrew Mellon, Secretary of the Treasury, has declared that he knows of 100 ways to evade the income tax. New ways are being found every day, or at least every tax day. It is widespread popular distaste for paying taxes, rather than any other reason, which has made the revision of federal taxes so acute a problem. The Mellon Plan, the Garner Plan, the Longworth Plan all seek to find some new anodyne for the taxpayers' pain again. Anodyne, I'm going to look that one up. Anodyne. Okay. Okay, I must have spelled that wrong. Google's not even pulling it. That's why. N for Nelly. Anodyne, not likely to cause offense or disagreement, and somewhat dull. This podcast is anodyne. Now, where was I? Seek to find some new anodyne for the taxpayer's pain. The protagonists of each recoil from the other plans as from contagion. At the bottom of the whole problem is the inescapable fact that there is no such thing as an equitable tax. The government taketh away. In fairness to the legislators and executives, it must be admitted that the government does not want tax money for the pleasure of getting rich. The problem is to find enough money to pay government expenses. This involves the inner problem of deciding what those expenses shall be. It is manifest to everyone that certain governmental functions must be carried on. The extra furnish the controversy. What are extras? Is a soldier bonus an extra? Mr. Mellon and many others say it is. The American Legion and its many supporters in both houses of Congress say that it is not. Right there is a $5 billion controversy, which again emphasizes the lack of equity in taxation. The existing congressional controversy revolves around tax reduction, with a curious disdain of facts, such as the fact that if a bonus is voted, there must be money with which to pay it. Congress proceeds with efforts to enact the tax reduction measure and simultaneously a bonus bill. But as Congress has separated the two problems and kept each in a hermetically sealed political arc. Okay, I'm looking up hermetically because I can't read something and not understand it and gain much benefit from it in a way that is completely airtight. Okay. But as Congress has separated the two problems and kept each in hermetically sealed political arc to prevent it from drafts which might be started. Hang on, that's not reading right. To prevent it from drafts which might be started if the two measures came face to face, they must be considered separately. That's why I like the way this guy writes. Cool, cheers. Now, where was I? So then the difference of opinion in Congress is on the question of how much shall taxes be reduced. A tax revision bill passed as the House of Representatives. All measures or raising revenue, says the Constitution, must originate in the House of Representatives. What happens to them thereafter seems to be no concern of the of the Constitution. Under the Constitution, the House may plant an acorn. If, as a result of the Senate's nurture, the yield turns out to be a turnip, that is no concern of the Constitution. The seed was planted in the lower and representative body. The government's loss in revenue is, of course, the taxpayer's gain, in that so much less is to be required of him. Mr. Longworth saves the taxpayer $446 million. Mr. Garner of Texas, the ranking Democratic member of the Committee on Ways and Means, saves the taxpayer $559 million. And Mr. Mellon, whose plan has the unqualified endorsement of President Coolidge and the regular Republicans saves the people but $323 million. Mr. Mellon adherents declare his plan is the sound one. Mr. Garner's friends say his plan is the most friendly one to the people. Mr. Longworth and his friends frankly admit that this is the best compromise between the other two plans which they can make. The Treasury surplus at the end of the present fiscal year, June 30, 1924, so this is some old stuff, is estimated officially at $329 million. The surplus, Treasury surplus, okay. So some people are promising more than they can actually deliver via the surplus. Anyway, the surplus at the end of the year is fiscal year June 30, 1924 is estimated at $329 million. And at the end of the fiscal year ended June 30, 1925, if tax rates are not changed, at $395 million. Thus, it will be seen that Mr. Mellon's plan provides for a tax reduction, leaving a treasury surplus of $6 million. That is, his plan is designed to give the people the benefit of the surplus, but no more. Mr. Longworth's compromise would create a treasury deficit of $117 million, while Mr. Garner's plan would create a deficit of $230 million. The belief that the Longworth bill is the least painful is evidenced by the fact that there were but 8 dissenting votes against it when it passed the House. The Longworth plan fixes normal income tax rates at 2% compared with 3% in the Mellon plan. Mr. Garner's normal rate also was 2%. This rate applies to taxable income up to $4,000, above which the rate scales upward. Along with surtaxes begin at 2% on $12,000, reaching 50% at $200,000, but with the proviso that on the basis of such an assessment, only 75% of taxes shall be paid. The Mellon plan puts a maximum of 25 cents on surtaxes, while Mr. Garner provides a maximum of 44%. Existing law starts them at 1% on $6,000 and runs them up to 50%. The surtax controversy revolves around the question of suppression of business. Mr. Mellon and other components of high surtaxes asserts that the business is retarded by high surtaxes. Men of property refraining from engaging in promotive enterprises in fear of the toll imposed by government on their profits. Also, they say high surtaxes drive wealth into tax-exempt securities. The opposite view is that the rich should pay. The question may be called one of psychology. The law of diminishing returns is enmeshed in the consideration. Ash, what does enmeshed mean? I don't know. I'll look it up. Enmeshed. Past tense, enmeshed. Cause to become entangled. Is something. Okay. Oh, enmeshed. Okay, yeah. Where was I? Enmeshed. Oh, I thought you might know because that's so good. Enmeshed. Okay, so law of diminishing returns is enmeshed. Okay, in the consideration, this is the law in which some of the liberals have little confidence. They assert that this fiction conjured up by rich men who desire to escape taxation. Okay, it's interesting. They assert that it is a fiction conjured up by rich men who desire to escape taxation. Interesting. Yeah, true. Intermingled. On the one hand is the man of property who says he will not invest capital to employ workmen and turn the wheels of industry when surtaxes are so high that they snatch away the rewards of enterprise. Such a man argues that the government loses because it fails to collect not only his tax, but the taxes, excise, income, and so forth, which would arise as incidents of the employment of labour by him. On the other hand, the reformer pledge to the interests of the poor man asserts that it is the rich man who should bear the burden of taxation, because he is best able to do so, and therefore taxes should be high, taking their chance of catching whom they can. The avariciousness. Okay, I want to look up avariciousness. The avaricious, the extreme greed for material wealth. The avariciousness, I like that word. The extreme greed of the avariciousness of the rich is such that they will get into business one way or another, no matter what the surtaxes. In view of the supporters of high surtax rates, and the government will get more out of the bargain by keeping the rates high than by entering into any reducing operation intended to have the effect of putting salt on the bird's tail. Democrats and other high surtax advocates doubt the efficacy of such rates. Secretary of the Treasury Mellon quotes eloquent tables showing how, under higher surtax rates, tax returns diminish year by year, owing to the waywardness and timidry. What? Year by year, owing to the waywardness and timidry. It's not registering that one. Lack of courage or confidence. Okay. The waywardness. Doing only what you want in the way that is difficult to control. Doing only what you want in the way. Okay. Interesting. Owing to the waywardness and timidity of capital, which cause it to retire into secure fastness. Such capital, says the other camp, will retire into the eye of a needle, if need be, to escape taxation. Low rates will not bring it about and make it bear fruit for the Treasury. All this is a matter of opinion, coloured, dyed, and flavoured by political learnings and economic convictions. It takes years to prove any of the theories, and then one cannot be sure. So this is why I like this guy's writing. So it's like he points out the way it is, and then he says, by the way, it takes years to prove if any of these theories are actually even true or not, or is it just a bunch of crap. The Longworth plan includes a gift tax. Opponents of the Mellon plan have repeatedly asserted that rich men resort to gifts as a means of disturbing their property to escape the estate taxes. There is no gift tax at present, nor did Mr. Mellon propose one. In fact, when he appeared before the Finance Committee of the Senate on March 12th, he strongly opposed the gift tax, saying, "This is a tax on capital, the proceeds of which do not go into capital, and therefore work a destruction of the total capital of the country." He went on to show that such a tax would mean little or nothing to the Treasury by way of revenue, that it would be difficult to enforce and collect, and that it has peculiar incidents unlike any of the other tax. The one who gives pays the tax, and not the one who receives. The one who gives pays the tax. Okay. So anyway, just thinking of like, what if the Fed just gives away? Anyway, any student of the tax conversely pending before Congress is forced to the conclusion that there is no question of fact involved. That opinion, and perhaps interest, control. The struggle now in the Senate may be regarded as between the Longworth Compromise, which was enacted by the House of Representatives, and the original Mellon Plan, which many senators will attempt to revive. The Ghana Plan is by no means extinct, and there is a possibility that some further compromise between the Mellon and Longworth plans on the one hand and between the Mellon and the Ghana plans on the other may be attempted. So, if we could change topic slightly after reading that, that went from a pretty well worded, I thought was a pretty well worded presentation of why one policy was better than the other, or how, arguments from both sides, to current day analysis of politicians. It's very different in today's current landscape, I think, anyway. More often than not, you'll see, I guess, hit pieces against one politician as opposed to particular policies about what taxes they're opposing and how they're going to get the money and how they're going to spend the money, which is something that maybe I'm just missing. But yeah, that is why I enjoy the way this particular writer writes. Now, how long has this been going for? Way too long. I'm just using up the YouTube servers. I'll continue on from now with reading this article, although we now know it's out of date, so there's not much point to it, but I think it is worth covering. Well, I want to cover it because I think it'll benefit myself. Before I do, though, just to confuse things, where is it here? So this is like the updated all the information about the Federal Reserve Act. The Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. It has the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 established the Federal Reserve System as the central bank of the United States to provide the nation with a safer, more flexible, and more stable monetary financial system. The law sets out the purpose, structure, and functions of the system, as well as outlines aspects of its operations and accountability. Congress has the power to amend the Federal Reserve Act, and which has done several times over the years. The complete act as amended is provided here by section. So if one wants to understand the Federal Reserve, one would have to come here and read every single page. Switzerland has some home gift laws. Cool. So I'm actually not sure about the gift laws in Australia. I think once you hit a certain threshold, it becomes beyond the gift, and then it goes into the tax realm. Again, not tax advice by any means, just general in nature. Switzerland has some gifts. Cool. So they get, is it favorable or unfavorable? I could look it up, but I'll just skip that. Sorry, Ash, not sure what to do with that one in terms of Switzerland's home gift laws. Let's give a home. Okay. So you could is it limited to, so yeah, family, you'd be limited to family though, because otherwise you'd be just giving away houses. See, now I'm interested in that. We'll look it up. Let's have a look. Normally, spouses and registered partners and their descendants, children and grandchildren do not have to pay tax on gifts. Wow. No shit. I'm impressed. Normally. Are you kidding me? Gifts. How much gift? Oh, but see, it's only behind. Wait, that can't be right. I'd have to go to their regulatory body to actually see what is what. Below. Yeah, it changes. It's pretty broad. Shit. Sorry, I find that funny. I shouldn't just laugh randomly. The Swiss legislation, gift taxation is a tax on transfers of money, property, other people. For instance, someone gives property free of charge. The gift must be paid by the receiver. For instance, oh, okay. So if you gave it to someone else in that example, family loss. KPMG. Acceptable, why not? Sorry, getting sidetracked here. I just find that interesting. In general principles, in Switzerland, there is currently neither an inheritance nor a gift tax at the federal level. The cantons are sovereign, and the decision to levy inheritance. Interesting. I have no idea what that means. Like the cantons, for example. Man, that gets complex pretty quick. Maybe I go on a holiday to Switzerland. Let's go straight to the conclusion. The inheritance and gift tax rules, which vary from canton to canton. Canton must be like a state, possibly. Offer challenges, but if designed with foresight, they represent an attractive instrument for individual estate planning. Thus, in many cases, estate planning without inheritance or gift tax consequences is possible in Switzerland. Wow. Thus, in many cases, estate planning without inheritance or gift tax is possible in Switzerland. However, the specifics of the individual case as well as the international. Okay, yeah, fair enough. That would change the definition of brother, you know. Anyway, not an expert in that, but I will look up into that because that seems pretty interesting. Now back to my Federal Reserve Act. This one. I'll cover this briefly. What I was going to say also was the reports you read through goes through a lot of data. Then the website breaks down even further. It breaks down the districts. I'll read this not today, but basically it shows the different Federal Reserve banks and what regions they cover. It also breaks down how the three key entities serving the public interest, the framers, as they keep referring to, of the Federal Reserve Act developed a central banking system that would broadly represent the public interest. I'll get my image out of the way. And we've got Congress oversees the Federal Reserve System and its entities. Board of Governors is an independent agency of the federal government. And then we've actually got the Federal Reserve Banks, how are the operating arms of the Federal Reserve System and are supervised by the Board of Governors. Then we have the FOMC, the Federal Open Market Committee, consists of the members of the Board of Governors and Reserve Bank Presidents. The chair of the board is the FOMC board. Now, further, I won't read all of this today. It does have, which is what I found interesting, the Federal Reserve Bank's combined quarterly financial report, unaudited, June 30, 2022. It breaks down a somewhat of a financial statement. Basically, assets, loans, system open market account, liabilities and capital, system open market account, deposits, total liabilities, the actual figures. So if one wanted to audit the Fed, there might be a good start here. I'm not sure. It does have notes. What else has it got? It's got a lot of data, and it would be good. It would be good to see how it's changing over the past 12 months. What's increased, what's decreased. You could have a look at that sort of stuff if you wanted to. We can see here from June 30, 21, 22, 21, 22, whether the figure is increasing or decreasing, you know, as an example there. And this document is pretty large. Pretty sure that's the notes. Yeah, and I'll go through this another day, but that's pretty damn interesting and somewhat useful. Reserve requirements, we have done that one. Now this one, archive manual. Where is it? It actually had the individuals behind, like the Federal Reserve. It explains how the US president basically chooses who some of them are. Where is it? Footnotes, manual. We'll cover this here. Basically, you've got, like, I guess the code of federal regulations. So I was looking up this sort of stuff, and you know, how does the Federal Reserve come to existence? It's like put together through a lot of things, like the reserve requirement of Depository Institutions Regulation D. It was mentioned before because I was trying to find out about the reserve requirements. Then it turns out basically it's, you know, it's like written into law, the Code of Federal Regulations. This one is Part 204, Reserve Requirements of Depository Institutions Authority, under this section 12 USC 24A, 24C, 461, 601, 611, and 301. So this is the sort of stuff that you might need to be a lawyer to understand, and this is how you would possibly, once you understand it, you know, put forward any changes to the Federal Reserve Act, which it says the Congress can actually make. But then what would you be trying to change? How would you try and change it? I'm not sure. If there was something to do with a central bank digital currency, maybe they would have to make amendments to this sort of stuff. Not particularly this act, not that this act, this particular part, this law, but so this one here, the Federal Reserve System, 12 CFR Part 29, Regulation 1, document number R8, Federal Reserve Bank Capital Stock. It goes over agency, Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System, action, final rule, summary. It's got all these sorts of documents that are out there. And what I'm trying to, I guess, vaguely explain is for someone to really understand all of this would be a requirement, I'd imagine, before you'd want to start making changes, you know, putting forward to make changes. So if we want to understand the Federal Reserve a little bit better, maybe we have to start reading all of this and really digging deep and trying figuring out, you know, where maybe some weak points are. And then you can point out some weak points, you know, you can point out some things that you think could be improved or that is not efficient at the moment. So if we started to find articles relating to central bank digital currencies appearing, or, you know, reserves being set to zero and things like that, it might be brought to our attention, and we can then have a look and be like, what the fuck is this? What does this mean? Now, again, it's so complex, but yet how many people have actually read all of this, you know? This one here, the summary. The Board of Governors is publishing a final rule that amends Regulation 1 to automate non-merger related adjustments to member banks, subscriptions to Federal Reserve Bank capital stock. The final rule also makes certain technical amendments to Regulation 1 and conforming revisions to FR 2056 reporting from effective date 30 days after the date of publication in the Federal Register. For further information, contact these individuals. You may also contact us via email. So if you really got into this, you could actually probably reach out and be like, ask some relevant questions. Maybe, I'm not sure. The Reserve is not a regulator nor an authority, rather just suggests the cash rate. Well, that's what I'm saying. I don't know enough about how to word it at the moment. That's why I sort of want to make these ones. I think I might be wrong. Yeah, sorry, I shouldn't laugh at that, but that's what I'm saying. Like, we could say, like, we could all get together and say whatever we want, and then that's what gets passed around. But until we actually dive deep into it, maybe we should, like, just not fact check. I hate that word, but verify. Like, you know, verify, not trust. What's the word? Verify, not trust. Whatever it is. Maybe we dig right into it and find out what the actual fuck is going on, because like a lot of the world, I think we just let it go by and we don't actually understand what's going on, and maybe there's more power in ourselves that we just don't not aware to, you know. Maybe there's some things we can do, but yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like, when I read that, the Reserve is not a regulator nor an authority, rather it just suggests the cash rate. I think I might, like, when we say that, imagine if we just started saying that, and then we could tell enough people that, and then they might believe that, and then we go, oh shit, maybe we might be wrong though, you know. But yeah, well, if you look into it, about the Federal Reserve System, it conducts the nation's monetary policy, promotes stability of the financial system, promotes safety, soundness of the individual financial institution, fosters payment and settlement systems, safety and efficiency, promotes consumer protection and continued development. So that's what the Federal Reserve is. I guess that's what this website's for. It performs 5 general functions to promote the operation of the US economy and more generally the public interest, the Federal Reserve. It then goes on to explain that's what I'm saying. And that's why I thought I'll make this stream that I can go back and eventually over time, if I just read all this garbage, it's going to start sinking in. Because like I said, when I started reading this one, it was painful, man. It was like 2 hours. But then as I was reading it, midway through, I'm like, wait, hang on. And I flicked over to, I'll close it off now. I flicked over to the reserve requirements. And I'm like, wow, that's making sense now. And here we go. We've got the equation, interest, payment calculation balances in excess of the top penalty fee band. So this is how, you know, banks operate. Equation 2, interest payment calculation balance equal to lower to the top of the penalty fee band. So this stuff, yeah, I'll get into some of this. It looks pretty interesting. But yeah, anyway, sorry, off track a bit. I'll continue to read. Where is it? This one here. Again, sorry guys, this is like painfully boring this stream, I know, but it's just something I want to do, so I got to do it. Why not? It exhausts me a bit, but if I don't do it, I'll never do it. So why not? Here I go. V. Federal Reserve notes and national bank notes. I'm going to read this one out. It's going to be painful, and it's old and dated. It may not be relevant anymore, but some of it will make sense eventually. The power to issue notes is useful, but not as indispensable resource for institutions having the responsibilities which are placed upon the Federal Reserve banks. The issue of notes by a central bank enables it to supply domestic requirements for a currency without reducing its holding of reserve money. In the absence of the right of issue, it would only be necessary to accumulate in ordinary times a somewhat greater amount of reserve money. to provide for seasonal and emergency needs. General public confidence in the Federal Reserve banks would, however, be far less secure if they were not empowered to issue notes. Again, this article is back in like 1920s. This one's not from Homer Joseph Dodge, so I'm not much of a fan of this one. This is because of the exaggerated importance of universally attached to the right of no issue, even in countries in which the check has become a universal medium of payment. The particular provisions in the Act regarding the issue of notes are extremely complicated and are in some respects quite without precedent. The notes for which provisions are made in the Bull of the Monetary Commission were to be banknotes, pure and simple, but subject to a variety of restrictions designed to keep the total amount issued within safe limits. Now, reading this, I can imagine if they had the technology back in the day, like blockchain technology, how much easier some of this could be. But would their contract that they write be immutable, or would it be subject to, as they change their mind, they update the contract, which would be very interesting. Anyway, sorry, off topic there. The notes which are to be issued under the provisions of the Act are certainly quite as well safeguarded in this respect. In addition, the notes are made obligations of the government of the United States, which also undertakes to redeem them at Washington. The obligation of the government is an addition and does not take the place of any banking safeguard. It is designed to meet the desires of a very large number of people throughout the country who believe that the issue of money is a government function. To many bankers and others familiar with our past financial history, this provision in the bill was most distasteful. Their opposition, though natural, was however neither very practical nor reasonable. It was based very largely upon the fear that the government obligation on the notes would prove an entertaining wedge for an issue of fiat money at some future time. I'm not sure what they mean by that. It was based very largely upon the fear that government obligation on the notes would prove an entertaining wedge for an issue of fiat money at some future time. But paper money cannot be issued under the terms of the Act for the purpose of meeting government expenditures. Additional legislation will be necessary, and the possibility of such legislation is not appreciably increased by making the notes which are to be issued by the Reserve Bank an obligation of the government. On the other hand, so it gets pretty complex. On the other hand, this provision won many friends for this important piece of banking legislation. It allayed opposition, which would always have been a serious menace to the permanence of the new system. The quantity of the new notes which may be issued is wholly within the control of the Federal Board, but with the initiative in taking out circulation rests entirely with the boards of directors of the reserve banks. Application for notes may be made at any time by a reserve bank to its district reserve agent. Again, this has changed because this is older information. Basically, new information has come out, and yeah, that's why we go into the other website. But for the time being, this is a good beginning point. Application for notes may be made at any time by a reserve bank to its district reserve agent, the member of its board of directors, who is the medium of communication between the bank and the board. Rediscounted commercial loans equal in amount to the notes applied for must be deposited with the agent, and a reserve in gold of 40% must be maintained. Again, this is, before the gold standard was removed, and many of those notes probably will make more sense as we go over this stuff. A reserve of 35% in gold or lawful money is required against deposits. Again, that might have changed. The board may grant the whole or in part or reject entirely applications for notes, and may also impose such interest charges upon the notes as it may deem advisable. It's not immutable. The notes, did you know in Australia, if I transfer from my bank to your bank account, it must route through? I did not know that. Is that real? I didn't know that. Did you know in Australia, money from my bank account to your bank account, it must go through? It must route through the Reserve Bank. So, does that mean the entire system is basically the Reserve Bank system here in Australia? I mean, that would make sense. I want to look that one up. So, if we do a transfer, let's have a look. That's pretty interesting stuff. Let's have a look. See this, so we could go here. This is what we should be looking at then. Relevance for the Australians. Where is it? Here. This will be the next one, I'm guessing. Reserve Bank Information and Transfer System. Overview of functionality. Oh, this one looks fun too. Yay. The Swift. Alright. God damn it, Ash. Now that's on my list of things to do. Alright. Not today. Not today. I can either confirm or deny that comment regarding Australia transfer bank accounts at this point in time. So I will continue on. When I have the answer, I'll go back to you. Maybe. Because I don't know, that's pretty interesting. But that's the sort of stuff I'm trying to I guess it might be useful to understand that sort of stuff in regards to the US and then different countries and then how they all intermingle. But yeah. What's going on, chat? I have no idea. Alright, I want to continue on. Where is it? The notes are to be prior lien on the assets of issuing banks, and there is therefore no possibility of loss. No possibility of loss to note holders nor any of the government on account of the obligation which it assumes. But back to you, I do find that stuff interesting, like how the actual flow of money exists and the not the system so much, but the I guess the ledgers they keep them on and how they talk to each other. It's pretty interesting stuff. Because it would be like, I don't think it's the same thing all around the world, but it'll be pretty similar. We have the US Federal Reserve. I seem to focus on that one basically because they have the most influence around the world, and usually most countries copy, you know. But yeah, I will bring up got this old economics book. Basically explains how the money is created, but it doesn't explain how it's created in reference to like the RBA, in reference to the US, in reference to say France, in reference to say Finland, or you know, Germany, or any other country I can think of, Japan, you know. But yeah, cool. Now, but it is an interesting formula. The bank, and is therefore no possibility of loss to note holders nor to any government on account of the obligation on which it assumes. So it's more like a big giant accounting record, you know. Such part of the 40% gold reserve against the notes may be deemed advisable by the Secretary of Treasury, but in no case less than 5% must be deposited in the Treasury of the United States for the redemption of the notes in Washington. Each reserve bank is required to redeem not only its own notes, but also those of other reserve banks, either in gold or in lawful money. Redemption in Washington is in gold alone. Again, this is old. In practice, it is certain that the reserve banks will redeem notes in gold over the counter, and it is also certain that slight use will be made of the redemption machinery at Washington. Member banks will certainly deposit notes with their own reserve banks, which are required to accept the notes of other banks at par. So it's pretty complex stuff. The reserve banks, in turn, are required under the law to return for redemption the notes issued by other reserve banks. Redemptions, I guess, also not so much enemy related, but like to know your enemy, you must understand your enemy. Not that, you know, banks are the enemy or anything of DeFi or like anything like that, but when we see how banks sort of roll in to other sectors of the world, how they roll into, you know, the funding of wars, how they roll into the funding of pharmaceutical companies, how they roll into the destruction of the environment, and you could argue all sorts of things. It's very interesting to see, to follow the money, and I guess trace the money at the source. It's just something I'm kind of fascinated in. Like, where did it all start? How did it all start? Okay, history lesson. The reserve banks, in turn, are required under law to return for redemption the notes issued by other reserve banks. Redemption at Washington has apparently been provided because national banknotes are redeemed there in large volume every year, a result of the circumstance that the present number of issuing banks is so large to make counter-redemption much more costly. Various provisions in the Act are evidently designed to keep the issue of notes within safe limits, but not too much reliance should be placed upon them. Reserve banks cannot, under penalty of a prohibitive tax of 10%, pay out the notes of other reserve banks. If these banks, like the Scotch banks, were working in the same territory, regular redemption would check over issue on the part of any one of them. But under a system of regional banks, each with its own territory, like we saw before the graphs, there will be only a very irregular relation between the amount of notes put out by anyone and the amount which will be received by the others. Moreover, it should be borne in mind that regular redemption is no check whatever upon general expansion, either in the form of notes or of deposits, when all banks are expanding credit at the same time. Not much effort also in checking over issue is to be looked for from those provisions in the Act which require 40% reserve in gold and impose a graduated tax upon reserves deficiencies. Interesting. That reminds me of how the SDR system works. That'll be another topic we look at. A considerable part of the total reserves of the reserve bank is certain to be in gold, and deposit liabilities are certain to be vastly greater than those for notes in circulation. The circumstances are highly conceivable in which a reserve bank would not have an amount of gold in its entire reserve ample to provide the gold reserve for such notes it might issue. The special tax on note reserve deficiency can therefore be readily evaded by shifting deficiency to the reserves against deposits deficient. Hang on, there's a full stop there. Evaded by shifting the deficiency to the reserves against deposits. Deficient reserves are only allowed when reserves requirements are suspended by the Federal Reserve Board. The board is to impose a graduated tax on all deficiencies except in the note reserve. On note reserve deficiencies, the tax imposed in the law is to be added to the rate of discount of the reserve banks. The arrangement would seem to be a most unworkable one, since there is no means of knowing to what extent a borrowing bank will have occasion to use the proceeds of its loan in the form of notes. Fortunately, this provision of the Act is never likely to become operative. After all, for proper use of the right of issue under this Act, the main reliance must and should be on wise and experienced management for the reserve banks, and above all on the conservative Federal Reserve Board, restrictions which would make over issue impossible. So they can't double spend, basically. Okay, so would also deprive the right of what was it? Restrictions which would make over-issue impossible would also deprive the right of issue of all usefulness as a means of extending credit. Moreover, the danger of over-expansion of credit in the form of deposits is vastly greater than in the form of banknotes in any country in which deposits, credit, have become the more important credit medium. One of the most perplexing questions that presented itself in framing the Act was, I use that word again, framing. The Act was the disposition to be made of the national banknotes and the 2% government bonds which secure very nearly all of them. When the measure reached the Senate, it contained provisions which contemplated the gradual substitution of Federal Reserve notes for the national banknotes, but when it pointed out that this would require the reserve banks regularly to rediscount at a $700 million of commercial paper in order to support the existing volume of currency, it was felt that some other arrangement must be made. Again, this is how the Federal Reserve was created. A plan to unify all the varieties of paper money now in circulation, with the exception of the silver certificate, by the issue of an equal amount of United States notes, backed by an ample gold reserve, found influential support, but it was wisely decided to present this in a separate measure. The particular provisions regarding the national banknotes and the bonds contained in the Act should be regarded, therefore, as a temporary arrangement pending future legislation. Again, if anyone's still watching, sorry, all super boring stuff. In order to avoid the contraction of the currency, which would follow the refusal of many national banks to enter the system, each reserve bank is authorized to purchase bonds and take out circulation similar in all respects to the notes issued by the national banks. After the end of a period of 2 years, additional bonds may be purchased, but only from member banks and at the discretion of the Federal Reserve Board. Member banks desiring to retire circulation and dispose of their bonds may make application to the board, which may require the reserve banks to purchase them. No more than $25 million of bonds may be purchased in any 1 year, and I'm pretty sure, what was the quantitative easing amount? Anyway, and the amount purchased is to be distributed among the various reserve banks in proportion to their capital stock. And I think they have the formulas in the website. Bonds thus purchased may be used as a basis for additional national banknotes by the reserve banks, or they may be converted into 3% government obligations. 1/2 into 30-year 3% bonds, and 1/2 into 1 year 3% notes, both issues without the circulation privilege. In taking the 1 year notes, a reserve bank enters into an obligation to purchase an equal amount at the successive maturity for 30 years. The purpose of the notes is to provide... Who locks up their money for 30 years, right? Anyway, the purpose of the notes is to provide the reserve banks with a readily marketable asset, the sale of which abroad may prove serviceable in periods of strain, and the domestic sale of which will enable the reserve banks to make their discount rates effective in the money market. Government short-term obligations are used for these purposes by many of the European central banks. The existing volume of national banknotes will not be reduced under the term of the Act, except in so far as the reserve banks convert 2% bonds into 3% bonds or notes. There may even be some slight increase in the total national banknotes in circulation, since banks may use for this purpose the small quantity of bonds not already absorbed in this way. Little concern, however, need be felt because the national banknotes are not to be retired. Present requirements for money to be used outside the banks are sufficient to absorb all notes at present, and with growth in population and somewhat greater quantity could be absorbed in the future. Lending operations of the Federal Reserve Banks. This will be interesting. The normal lending operations of the Federal Reserve banks are limited to the rediscounting for member banks of commercial loans maturing within 90 days. Commercial loans are generally defined in the Act as notes, draft, and bills of exchange arising out of actual commercial transactions. That is, notes, drafts, and bills of exchange issued or drawn from for agricultural, industrial, or commercial purposes, or the proceeds of which have been used or are to be used for such purposes. The Federal Reserve Board is authorized to define more precisely the nature and character of eligible paper. To make assurance doubly sure, the rediscount of loans secured by stocks and bonds is specifically prohibited. To make assurance doubly sure, the rediscount of loans secured by stocks and bonds is specifically prohibited. Okay. The Act also provides that 6 months maturities of paper drawn and used for agriculture purposes or based on livestock may be rediscounted. In confining rediscounts to commercial loans, the Act is more stringent than that governing the operations of central banks in Europe. In practice, however, the bulk of the loans of these institutions are in connection with commercial transactions. While this restriction may in some particular emergency hamper the reserve banks in giving assistance to some threatened bank, it is upon the whole amply justifiable. What? It is upon the whole amply. Look up amply. Enough, yeah, amply. Okay, cool. Is upon the whole amply justifiable. Now, under our banking system in the past, the collateral loans have enjoyed a prestige which it is hoped to be transferred to commercial loans. Exclusion of collateral loans from rediscount will certainly contribute much to bring this about. The restriction also gives the public greater confidence that the resource of reserve banks will be generally available throughout the entire country. One of the reasons which has been advanced for confining rediscounts or commercial loans is based upon certain misconceptions of the true nature of commercial paper, misconceptions which, if adopted by the management of the reserve banks in formulating their policy, may have disastrous consequences. It has been contended on all sides during the last few years that commercial paper was from its very nature liquid, and further that credit could therefore safely be granted to the extent limited only by the amount of such paper. Both of these contentions are hopelessly fallacious. In an emergency, no kind of loan is liquid to any considerable extent. Businesses cannot suddenly be deprived of the amount of credit to which it has become adjusted. It is indeed often said that loans based upon any commodity entering into general consumption can be quickly liquidated. This can be done as regards any particular loan, but supplies for the immediate and distant future must be in process of production and they will require a new batch of loans. Okay. The view that credit can safely granted the full extent of merchandise in process of distribution and even in process of manufacture is equally fallacious. Credit affects price. Liberal discounts may cause speculative advances in commodity prices, stimulating excessive prices by wholesale jobbers and retailers as well as speculative holders pure and simple. There is no mechanical or statistical test for the amount of credit which may be safely granted, whether the loans be commercial or collateral. Overexpansion is possible by both operations. Commercial loans will become the most liquid asset that member banks can hold simply because they can be rediscounted with the reserve banks. A smaller amount of bank funds will be employed in the call loan market, but whatever amount remains available for that use will be subject to far less seasonal fluctuation, both in volume and in rates. The retention of fixed reserve ratios, even though they may be suspended by the Federal Reserve Board, will probably lead to many city banks to use the call loan market to a moderate extent, since it will enable them to avoid the necessity of resorting to the reserve banks for rediscounts whenever reserves monetarily drop below legal requirements. Somewhat larger proportion of time loans will doubtless be used in connection with the stock exchange dealings, but the available supply of call money will presumably be sufficient to permit the continuance of the present American practice of daily delivery of securities. Fascinating. At the outset, on account the widespread prejudice among bankers against rediscounting, is demand for accommodation from the reserve banks may not be large. But this prejudice will surely die away in time, and most, if not all, of the reserve banks will suffer from no lack of regular business. Except in periods of business depression. Member banks in those parts of the country in which supply of credit is inadequate for local requirements will lend more closely, while banks which regularly have more funds than can be thus employed will purchase more commercial paper from the note brokers and perhaps rediscount for banks in those parts of the country in which rates are normally high. Okay, cool. Aside from the government account, member banks are to provide the funds for the reserve banking system. Competition with member banks would therefore and justly occasion serious dissatisfaction. Managed by a board of directors, a majority of the membership of which is to be selected by the member banks, there would seem to be little danger of serious competition from the reserve banks. Nevertheless, the Act places such restrictions upon dealings by the reserve banks with the general public that little or no competitive will be possible. The reserve banks are permitted to engage in three kinds of open market operations. Number one, dealings in government securities and also in obligations of the states and local bodies maturing within 6 months and issued in anticipation of taxes. 2, dealings in foreign exchange, and 3, dealings in domestic bills of exchange. The purchase and sale of government bonds and notes and state and local short-term obligations require no detailed consideration. In periods of inactive demand for rediscounts, investments of this kind will doubtlessly be made by the reserve banks in order to employ surplus funds. The right to engage in foreign exchange dealings will also be similarly useful, surplus funds being invested in foreign bills. Moreover, if any of the reserve banks find that their resources are regularly in excess of domestic requirements, they may be used to facilitate the financing of the foreign trade of the country with domestic capital. It is also very generally believed that the power to engage in foreign exchange operations may be so used that it will be possible to rely upon securing abundant foreign funds in periods of financial strain. This is most unlikely, they said. It is entirely possible for a small country to rely upon holdings of foreign bills as a means of influencing the foreign exchanges, and even for such supplies of gold as may be needed on occasions when confidence is threatened. But the banks of a large country must rely upon domestic resources, since the amount of cash and credit needed in an emergency is too great to be secured from foreign money markets. It should be the policy of the reserve banks to maintain themselves in a condition of such abundant strength as to be wholly independent of foreign assistance. This is the US. Moreover, if they maintain strong reserves in ordinary times, they will not be disturbed on account of gold exports. The gold exports, accounting to $50 or even $100 million, should not be made the occasion for obstructive measures such as are adopted by many of the European central banks. Measures of this kind are generally an indication that the credit structures rests upon an inadequate foundation. New York has been a free gold market in the past, and even under our imperfect banking system, there has always been a sufficient amount of gold for every banking purpose. Moreover, restrictions placed upon gold movements can have but temporary effects. In the long run, the distribution of gold among the various commercial countries is determined by fundamental influences which override all such artificial barriers. Interesting. The Act permits only one kind of banking business between reserve banks and the general public. They are allowed to buy and sell, or from individuals, firms, and corporations, as well as domestic and foreign bank bills of exchange of the kinds which are made eligible for rediscount. The purpose of this provision in the Act is to enable the reserve banks to secure somewhat employment for their funds when the demand for rediscount slackens, and to develop a broad discount market. A broad discount market may be developed under a new banking arrangement, but the prediction is ventured that this provision in the Act will not contribute to the development, and that in general it will be barren of results. It should be observed that the promissory note, the usual borrowing instrument in this country, although it may be used for rediscounting purposes, cannot be bought and sold in the open market of the reserve banks. Aside from the foreign trade, the mercantile bill of exchange payable at a future date has largely fallen into disuse in most advanced commercial countries. Imagine that if, pausing here for it, imagine if, some sort of cryptocurrency is more widely adopted. I guess that's the dream by many. But yeah, or if, worst case scenario, a central bank digital currency is more widely adopted, and they phase out fiat. I'm not sure. But then in the past, we have seen, that a mercantile bill of exchange and payable at future days largely fallen into disuse, so instruments can not be used as heavily as once they were. More and more cash payments are either insisted upon or are favored by the offer of a trade discount for considerably greater than bank discounts. When a purchaser pays cash, obviously a mercantile time bill of exchange cannot come into existence. In European countries, many purchasers who pay at once often draw a bill of exchange on their own bank, and after it has been accepted, discount it in the open market. In this country, banks are to be allowed under the Act to accept only bills drawn in connection with merchandise exports and imports. Material will therefore be lacking for a broad discount market if its development is dependent upon open market operations by the reserve banks. Fortunately, the development of a broad discount market does not require open market operations on their part. A broad discount market is one which many borrowers resort with full assurance that they will find many lenders. Even under past banking arrangements, many borrowers and lenders have been brought together through note brokers, but owing to the lack of an available supply of cash and credit with which to meet emergencies, this market has been subject to violent perturbations. Violent perturbations. That doesn't sound good. Perturbations. Anxiety, mental uneasiness. And at times dealings have been almost entirely discounted. In the future, a solvent borrower will feel more certain that his paper can always be marketed by his note broker, and banks will purchase more largely since they will prefer to use such paper for rediscounting purposes rather than that of their own regular customers. Additional powers of national banks. Alright. Additional powers of national banks. Nearly half of the national banks have established savings departments and now hold more than 800 million of saving deposits. This has been a recent development and one for which there was no specific authority in the national banking law, but under liberal interpretation of that law by the comptroller of the currency in recent years, it has been permitted because it was not forbidden. Okay. Many have doubted, however, whether the banks could enforce 30 and 60 days notice of the withdrawals of deposits, which, following the practice of regular savings banks, appeared on the passbooks issued to depositors. This uncertainty has been removed by implication by the new Act, which includes in its definition of time deposits savings accounts subject to at least 30 days notice. It is of course a great advantage to the national banks that the employment of these deposits are subject to much less restriction than is imposed upon saving banks in many of the states, subject to the permissions of the Federal Reserve Board, and when not in contravention of state laws, national banks may act as trustees, executors, administrators, and registrars of stocks and bonds. Many banks will find this a useful extension of their powers. If trust companies may properly engage in banking, there can be no good reason why banks should not undertake trust functions. The department store principle in banking has made rapid headway in most countries in recent years. So this is old, man. This is like when the department store was new. Under proper supervision, every kind of reasonable and safe financial business can be handled by a single institution safely in a way which is convenient for the business community. In some states, legislation may be necessary to permit national banks to undertake trust functions. In Massachusetts, it seems to be the opinion among lawyers that no legislation is required. Inability to lend on mortgage security has been the most serious disadvantage experienced by country national banks in competition with state institutions. That has been by far the best local security available over large parts of the country. Rural bankers have in fact taken it into account in making loans, and by various devices have succeeded in making it the security for many of the loans which they have granted. Under the Federal Reserve Act, all banks except those in Central Reserve cities may lend for periods not exceeding 5 years, 25% of the capital and surplus, or 1/3 of their time deposits on the security of unencumbered and improved farmland to 50% of its market value. Farmland. Sorry. Two changes are made in the law for the purpose of facilitating financial business with foreign countries. National banks having a capital of at least $1 million may establish foreign branches subject to the approval of Federal Reserve Board and to such regulations as it may be formulate for conducting this business. Banks may also accept bills of exchange maturing with 6 months drawn into connection with exports and imports of merchandise. These are desirable changes in the law. It is not, however, probable that many foreign branches will be established in the near future, and it is most likely that the American acceptance will make rapid headway in foreign markets. The scope of the following provision in the Act is uncertain, other than the usual salary or director's fee paid to any officer, director, or employee of a member bank of the other than reasonable fee paid by said bank to such an officer, director, or employee for services. Oh my god, it's so late. Okay. Where am I at? Alright. Hang on, where are we at? I'm gonna wrap this one up really soon. Additional powers of national banks. God, lost where I was. Oh my god. Oh, are you serious? Alright. Well, I'm going to have to wrap this one up because I just really looked at the time and it's pretty damn late, and I'm really getting stuck into this Federal Reserve Act research. Alright, I'll continue on tomorrow, I'm hoping, God willing, and in the meantime, I'll leave the view. Good. Where am I at? Hang on. 2:44. Hang on. Anyway, I'll go back. Like that, where I was up to, and I'll end the stream, and I'll continue on with the research tomorrow, people. thank you for tuning in. No idea where I was up to. Whoever's still watching, you're a legend. Thank you so much. You're far too kind. Alright, signing out.